Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Indianapolis was already 2 hours behind me when I decided to skip the interstate and take the back roads home that October evening. I'd just finished a job interview at a pharmaceutical company, my third that month since getting laid off. And honestly, the thought of sitting in rush hour traffic while replaying another rejection in my head seemed unbearable. Being 29 and starting over from scratch wasn't part of the plan, but neither was the factory closure that left half my town unemployed, so here I was, choosing random county roads through rural Indiana just to feel like I had some control over something. The cornfields rose up on both sides like canyon walls, dry and rustling in that late harvest way that makes everything sound like whispers. I'd lived in Fort Wayne my whole life, but these particular backroads were new to me, each turn revealing another stretch of identical stalks that seemed to go on forever, broken only by the occasional weathered barn or grain silo standing against the dimming sky. My phone battery was at 12% when I noticed the GPS had stopped updating 20 minutes ago. The little blue dot frozen somewhere near a town called Millbrook that I'd never heard of. The screen showed 6:52 p.m., and the October sun was already sinking behind the corn, throwing long shadows across the dirt road I'd somehow ended up on. I kept telling myself the next intersection would bring me back to pavement, back to civilization. But each turn just led deeper into the maze of agricultural roads that probably only made sense to the farmers who'd been driving them for generations. The Nissan Altima wasn't exactly built for this terrain. Every pothole sent a worrying creak through the suspension, and dust was billowing up behind me in thick clouds that caught the dying light. When the road narrowed to barely more than a tractor path, corn stalks scraping against both sides of my car, with a sound like fingernails on metal, I finally admitted to myself that I was completely, utterly lost. The engine started making the noise around 7:15, just as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the horizon. It began as a subtle clicking, like a playing card and bicycle spokes, but within minutes it had evolved into this grinding metal-on-metal sound that made my chest tight with panic. The temperature gauge was creeping toward the red zone, and wisps of steam were starting to curl up from under the hood, visible in the beams of my headlights that now provided the only illumination on this forgotten stretch of dirt. I pumped the brakes, feeling the car shudder and resist until I finally came to a stop in what seemed like the middle of absolute nowhere. The silence that followed when I turned off the ignition was complete. No distant highway noise, no dogs barking, not even the sound of farming equipment. Just the ticking of hot metal cooling and the endless rustling of corn that surrounded me on all sides, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows even with my high beams on. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at my phone as it searched desperately for even a single bar of signal. Nothing. The battery dropped to 11% while I watched, and I realized I needed to save what little power remained in case I found a spot with coverage. My hands were trembling. Not from cold, but from that special kind of fear that comes when you realize exactly how alone and unprepared you are. The nearest town I could remember passing was at least 40 minutes back, and that was when the car was actually running. I popped the hood release and stepped out into the October night, immediately hit by how much colder it had gotten once the sun went down. The air smelled like dried corn husks and diesel fuel, and underneath that, something else. Maybe fertilizer. Maybe just the scent of soil that had been baking all day and was now releasing its heat into the darkness. The hood was too hot to touch at first, and when I finally got it propped open, a cloud of steam billowed out, making me stumble backward into the dirt road. I knew absolutely nothing about cars beyond checking oil and adding windshield fluid, another life skill I'd always relied on others to handle. The engine block was making these pinging sounds as it cooled, and I could see fluid dripping steadily onto the ground, creating a dark puddle that looked black in the beam of my phone's flashlight. That's when I noticed it, a pinpoint of light moving through the corn, maybe 200 yards away, swaying slightly like someone walking with a flashlight. Relief flooded through me so fast I actually laughed out loud. Thank God, I thought. A farmer checking his fields, or maybe someone else whose car had broken down earlier. I raised my arm and was about to shout when something made me hesitate. The light wasn't moving along the rows like you'd expect from someone walking between planted corn. It was cutting straight through, stalks snapping and rustling, heading directly toward me. I stood there next to my dead car, watching that light get closer, and every instinct I had started screaming that something was wrong. Who walks through corn like that at night? The stalks are planted in rows specifically so you can walk between them during harvest. But this person, if it was a person, was bulldozing straight through like the corn wasn't even there. The sound reached me then, that distinctive crack and swoosh of breaking stalks, getting louder with each passing second. I turned in a slow circle, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing in the middle of this dirt road, with my car's headlights creating a bubble of visibility that probably made me look like a lighthouse in an ocean of darkness. There were no farmhouses visible in any direction, no distant porch lights or barn security lamps, just walls of corn that could have been hiding anything. The light stopped moving for a moment, maybe 100 yards away now, and I could swear whoever was holding it was watching me, evaluating, deciding something. My mouth went dry as I tried to call out a greeting, but the words died in my throat when the light started moving again. Faster this time, with purpose. The sound of breaking corn stalks grew louder, more violent, like someone was running through them now instead of walking. I scrambled back into my car, slamming the door and hitting the lock button so hard my finger hurt. The rational part of my brain kept saying this was probably just a farmer, maybe angry about someone being on his property. But farmers don't move like that through their own fields. They don't destroy their own crops. Through my windshield, I could see the light getting closer, maybe 50 yards now, and I could make out the shadowy outline of corn stalks falling away from whatever was pushing through them. My phone showed 9% battery when I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect. Just that horrible beeping sound that means no signal, not even for emergency calls. Then the light went out. Just like that, complete darkness where it had been, and the sound of breaking corn stopped too. The silence was worse than the noise had been because now I had no idea where they were or what they were doing. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, breathing so hard the windows were starting to fog up, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my pulse in my ears. A minute passed, then two, and I was just starting to think maybe they'd given up and left when something slammed into the passenger side of my car, hard enough to rock it on its suspension. I couldn't help the scream that ripped out of me as I jerked away from the door, my elbow hitting the horn which blared out into the darkness. Through the fogged passenger window, I could barely make out a shape, human-sized but wrong somehow, just standing there, perfectly still. Then came the sound that still wakes me up at night. Fingernails slowly dragging across the glass, deliberate and patient, like someone testing how strong it was. The scratching moved around the car methodically. Passenger window, rear passenger, back windshield, then stopping at the driver's side, right next to where I was hunched against the center console trying to make myself as small as possible. This close, even through the fogged glass I could see more details that made my whole body go rigid with terror. The person was wearing what looked like a medical gown, the thin kind they give you at hospitals, completely inappropriate for the cold October night. Their hair was long and matted, hanging in clumps that might have been blonde once but now looked gray with dirt or worse. But it was the eyes that made me bite down on my knuckle to keep from screaming again, wide open, unblinking, staring at me through the window with an intensity that felt like being studied by something that had forgotten how to be human. They raised one hand and placed it flat against the glass, and I could see dirt caked under those long fingernails, what might have been dried blood on their wrist. They tilted their heads slowly, like a dog hearing a strange sound, never breaking eye contact. I fumbled for my phone with numb fingers, desperate enough to try 911 again even though I knew it wouldn't work. 7% battery now. The figure outside started making sounds, not words exactly, more like attempts at words, these wet, gurgling noises that might have been speech if their throat wasn't damaged somehow. They kept tapping on the window with one finger, gentle and rhythmic, like they were trying to communicate in code. That's when I noticed the medical bracelet on their wrist, the plastic kind with printed information. Though I couldn't read it through the fog and darkness, a horrible thought crept into my mind. What if this person had escaped from somewhere, maybe a psychiatric facility or hospital? Indiana has several state facilities and someone in a medical gown wandering rural roads at night. But that didn't explain how they'd moved through the corn, or why they seemed to be enjoying this, because I swear I could see the corners of their mouth pulling up in something that wasn't quite a smile but wanted to be. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the figure stepped back from my car, disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlights' reach. For a moment, I dared to hope they were leaving, but then I heard the trunk pop open. I'd locked the doors but forgotten the trunk release was broken. It had been that way for months, just another repair I couldn't afford. The car shifted as weight settled into the trunk area, and I could hear them rummaging through my emergency kit, metal clanking against metal. The tire iron, they'd found the tire iron. Panic shot through me like electricity as I turned the ignition key, pumping the gas pedal and pleading with the dead engine to somehow miraculously start. Nothing but clicks and the wheeze of a motor that had given up. The trunk slammed shut, and footsteps circled back to my door, slow and measured. Then came the first hit, the tire iron smashing into my side mirror, sending plastic and glass spraying across the dirt. They weren't trying to break in yet, just showing me they could, demonstrating what was about to happen. I did the only thing I could think of, laid on the horn and didn't let up. The blaring sound split the night, echoing off the corn and hopefully, reaching someone, anyone who might call the police. The figure outside actually stumbled backward, hands going to their ears, that grotesque almost smile turning into a grimace of pain or anger. They swung the tire iron at my windshield but missed, hitting the hood instead with a metallic clang that left a dent I could see even in the darkness. My phone battery hit 5% as I kept my palm pressed on the horn, watching this person in a hospital gown rage against my car, swinging the tire iron wildly now, no longer methodical but furious. They tried to scream something over the noise, but it came out as more of that liquid gargling, and I realized with sick certainty that something was definitely wrong with their throat. Maybe self-inflicted, maybe the reason they'd been institutionalized in the first place. The horn kept blaring and I kept pressing, even as my ears rang and my head pounded, because stopping meant silence, and silence meant they'd start working on getting inside again. Then I saw them, headlights cutting through the darkness from the direction I'd come, bouncing over the rutted dirt road. The figure in the hospital gown saw them too, their heads snapping toward the approaching lights with animal-like alertness. They dropped the tire iron and, without any hesitation, turned and crashed back into the corn, vanishing into the stalks as suddenly as they'd appeared. The gurgling sounds faded quickly, swallowed by the rustling maze of dried corn that seemed to close behind them like water. I kept the horn going until the vehicle, a massive John Deere green pickup, pulled up beside me, an older man with a gray beard rolling down his window with a concerned, confused expression. I finally let go of the horn, my palm throbbing, ears ringing in the sudden quiet. The farmer, because that's what he was, asked if I was okay, said he'd been checking his irrigation equipment 2 fields over when he heard the horn going crazy. I tried to explain about the person in the hospital gown, pointing at the smashed mirror, the dents in my car, but my words came out jumbled and hysterical. He believed me though, told me there'd been an escape from Logansport State Hospital earlier that day, some patient with a history of violence who'd injured 2 orderlies getting out. The police had been searching the main roads, but nobody thought to check these back farm routes. He called it in on his CB radio while I sat there shaking, then waited with me for 40 minutes until the state police arrived with their dogs and searchlights. They found the tire iron right where it had been dropped, found footprints and torn fabric on a corn stalk, but the person was gone, swallowed up by miles and miles of agricultural land. The police took my statement, arranged for a tow truck, gave me a ride to a motel in the nearest town. They caught the patient 3 days later, hiding in an abandoned grain silo near Lafayette, nearly dead from exposure and dehydration. I never learned their name or what they'd done to end up in that hospital, and honestly, I didn't want to know. What I do know is that I haven't driven anywhere without a charger cable since, and I take the interstate now, always the interstate, no matter how bad the traffic is. The farmhouse came cheap because nobody wanted to drive 40 minutes just to get groceries. That suited me fine after the divorce papers went through in August. 37 and starting fresh seemed easier when the nearest neighbor lived 2 miles down the gravel road. The property stretched maybe 5 acres total, most of it taken up by corn that the previous tenant had planted but never harvested. By the time I moved in that September, those stalks stood almost 7 feet tall, creating a dense green wall that ran right up to my backyard. The realtor, Nancy something or other, kept apologizing about the unkempt field, promising the owner would have it cleared before winter. I told her not to worry about it. The rustling sound at night actually helped me sleep, like white noise from nature instead of those machines people buy in the city. The first signs appeared maybe 3 weeks after I settled in. I'd gone out one morning to drink coffee on the back porch, watching the sun climb over those endless rows of corn, when I spotted a crumpled McDonald's wrapper near where the grass met the field, then a Marlboro butt, still fresh enough that the filter hadn't yellowed from rain. My first thought was teenagers, probably local kids who'd found a spot to smoke where their parents wouldn't catch them. God knows I'd done the same thing at their age, sneaking behind the gymnasium with stolen cigarettes. The muddy footprint on my deck bothered me more, but October had been wet, and delivery drivers never watched where they stepped. I grabbed a trash bag, picked up the litter, and made a mental note to mention it to Nancy next time she called to check how I was settling in. Kids would be kids, and eventually they'd get bored and find somewhere else to hang out. A week passed before I found the makeshift bed. I'd been walking along the field's edge, looking for my cat Brutus, who liked to hunt mice in the tall grass, when I noticed how the corn stalks bent inward about 20 feet from my bedroom window. Not broken, just carefully pushed aside to create a narrow tunnel. Curiosity got the better of me, and I ducked into the opening, pushing through the dense leaves that scratched at my arms. The smell hit me first, stale sweat mixed with something chemical, like old cologne trying to mask body odor. Someone had flattened maybe 6 feet of corn stalks into a rough oval, creating a hidden pocket completely invisible from the outside. Empty beer cans lined one edge. A ratty sleeping bag lay crumpled in the corner, still damp from the morning dew. But what made my throat close up was the collection of cigarette butts arranged in a neat little pyramid, all Marlboros, all facing the same direction, toward my house. The logical part of my brain kept insisting this was still teenagers, maybe some kid who'd gotten kicked out and needed a place to crash. But teenagers didn't organize their trash like that. Teenagers didn't position themselves with a perfect sightline to my bedroom window, where the corn had been bent just enough to create a gap no bigger than a fist. I backed out of that space, my shirt catching on the rough stalks, and walked straight into my house to call the sheriff's department. The deputy who showed up, a young guy named Brandon who couldn't have been older than 25, walked through the space with me, took some photos, and promised they'd increase patrols. He suggested motion lights for the backyard and maybe some cameras if I could afford them. The way he kept checking his phone and glancing at his watch told me everything. Weird trash in a cornfield didn't exactly qualify as an emergency in his book. I installed the motion lights that same afternoon, driving to the hardware store in town and spending money I didn't really have on 4 industrial-strength floodlights. The clerk, an older man with grease under his fingernails, helped me pick out the brightest ones they had, the kind that would blind you if you looked directly at them. While I was there, I grabbed a deadbolt for the back door and one of those wooden dowels to jam in the sliding glass door track. The installation took me until dark, up and down the ladder with a drill that kept slipping in my sweaty palms. Every rustle from the corn made me whip around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the field stayed empty, just endless rows swaying in the evening breeze. That night the lights triggered constantly. A raccoon at midnight, wind-blown leaves at 2, a possum around 4. Each time that harsh white light flooded my yard, I'd jolt awake and peer through the blinds, scanning the illuminated grass for footprints, for movement, for anything that would prove I wasn't going crazy. The silence lasted 5 days. 5 days of motion lights catching nothing but animals. 5 days of checking that spot in the corn to find it undisturbed. 5 days of almost convincing myself that whoever it was had been scared off by the deputy's visit. Then, on Saturday night, all 4 lights went out at once. Not triggered, just dead like someone had cut the power. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the screen stayed black no matter how many times I pressed the button. The landline in the kitchen gave me nothing but silence. Even my laptop, which had been charging on the counter, wouldn't turn on. I stood in my dark kitchen, listening to my own breathing mix with the eternal rustling of corn. And that's when I heard it. The distinct sound of a sliding door being tested. That soft bump when someone lifts it to see if it's locked. The dowel held, but whoever was out there kept trying, patient and methodical, lifting and releasing, like they had all the time in the world. The testing stopped after maybe 10 minutes, but I knew he hadn't left. Through the kitchen window, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow passing between my car and the shed, too tall and upright to be an animal. My keys hung on the hook by the front door, 15 feet away, but reaching them meant crossing in front of the living room windows. The old farmhouse had too many windows, I realized. Windows I'd loved when I moved in because they let in so much natural light. Now each dark pane felt like an eye, like someone could be pressed against any of them, watching me stand frozen in my kitchen. I grabbed a knife from the block, the big one I used for chopping vegetables, and tried to think. The nearest neighbor, the Gibsons, lived 2 miles away. Even if I ran, even if I made it to the road, it would take 20 minutes to reach their house. 20 minutes in the dark with someone following through the corn, knowing every shortcut while I stumbled blind down the gravel road. A soft knock on the back door made me bite down on my own tongue to keep from screaming. Not pounding or aggressive, just 3 gentle taps, like a neighbor stopping by to borrow sugar. Then his voice came through the wood, conversational and calm, with this odd sing-song quality that made my spine go rigid. "I know you're awake in there. I've been watching you for weeks now, learning your routines. You make chamomile tea before bed, read those mystery novels in your bedroom until your eyes get heavy. You sleep on your left side, facing the window. Did you know you talk in your sleep sometimes? Mostly about work stress. But last night you said a man's name, Christopher. Is that the ex-husband?" He knew things no one could know unless they'd been inside my house, unless they'd stood next to my bed while I slept. The knife felt useless in my hand, a joke against someone who'd been close enough to hear me breathing in the dark, and I'd never even known. "The police won't come," he continued, his mouth so close to the door I could hear his lips brush the wood. "Your phone's dead, remember? And even if you got to your car, well, I took care of that earlier. Cut the fuel line while you were in the shower this evening. You use lavender shampoo, by the way. The smell carries through the bathroom vent." My legs started shaking so hard I had to lean against the counter to stay upright. This morning's shower, I'd felt safe, normal, washing my hair and planning my weekend. He'd been right outside, close enough to smell my shampoo, sabotaging my car while I stood naked and vulnerable behind a thin curtain. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, and I heard something metal scraping against the door frame. "You're going to let me in, and we're going to talk about why you've been so rude, ignoring me when I've put so much effort into getting to know you. Or I'm going to come in anyway and we'll have a very different conversation." The scraping sound meant he was working on the lock, and the old farmhouse doors weren't exactly high security. I had maybe 2 minutes before he got through. The front door was an option, but running into the dark meant running blind while he knew the property better than I did after weeks of surveillance. Hiding seemed pointless when he'd already proven he could get inside whenever he wanted. Then I remembered the crawl space access in the bedroom closet. The realtor had mentioned it during the tour, apologizing for the lack of a proper basement. It led under the house, coming out through a wooden panel near the front porch that looked decorative from the outside. If I could get into the crawl space before he broke through the back door, maybe I could slip out the front while he searched the house. I moved as quietly as I could toward the bedroom, avoiding the creaky board near the hallway that I'd learned about my first week here. Behind me, the scraping continued, mixed with his humming, Some tune I didn't recognize, cheerful and wrong in the darkness. The crawl space was exactly as horrible as I'd imagined. Maybe 3 feet high, dirt floor, thick with spider webs and the smell of rotting wood. I pulled the panel closed behind me and started crawling, trying not to think about what else might be down here with me. My knees sank into the soft earth, and something with too many legs skittered across my hand. Above me, I heard the back door finally give way, then heavy footsteps moving through my kitchen. "Where did you go?" His voice was louder now, annoyed rather than conversational. "This doesn't have to be difficult. I've been patient, haven't I? Weeks of watching, waiting for the right time to introduce myself properly." The footsteps moved toward the living room and I crawled faster, my fingers searching for the panel that should be somewhere ahead. The space narrowed as I went, forcing me to army crawl on my belly through dirt that tasted like decay when I accidentally breathed through my mouth. His footsteps stopped directly overhead, and I heard him opening closet doors, checking rooms, methodical in his search. My fingers finally found the wooden panel, and I pushed against it slowly, terrified it would creak. Cool night air hit my face as it opened, and I could see my front yard bathed in moonlight, the road just 50 yards away. I squeezed through the opening, dirt in my hair and eyes, and started running before I was even fully standing. Behind me, I heard him yell. Not words, just raw frustration when he realized I wasn't in the house. The gravel road tore at my bare feet, but I kept running, powered by adrenaline and terror. Halfway to the Gibsons' house, headlights appeared ahead, their teenage son Nathan coming home late from work. I practically threw myself in front of his truck, screaming for help, probably looking absolutely insane covered in dirt and spider webs. But Nathan didn't hesitate. He pulled me into the truck, locked the doors, and drove straight to his parents' house while calling 911 on his cell. When the real deputies arrived an hour later, not Brandon but older officers who took everything seriously, they found my back door broken, muddy footprints through my house, and that sleeping spot in the corn. But the man himself was gone, vanished into the miles of farmland and forest that surrounded the county. They never caught him. The investigation turned up DNA from the sleeping bag, fingerprints on my door frame, but nothing in any database. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Diane Russell, who'd worked stalking cases for 15 years, told me that wasn't unusual. "Some of these guys, they're ghosts until they escalate," she said, sitting across from me at the police station, while I gave my 5th statement. "You were smart to run. Smart to trust your instincts about those first signs." They found more evidence in the corn over the following days. Notebooks wrapped in plastic with detailed observations about my daily routines. Photographs taken through my windows with a telephoto lens. Even recordings of my phone conversations somehow captured from outside the house. The quantity suggested he'd been watching for months before I moved in. That maybe he'd been watching the property itself, waiting for someone like me, alone, isolated, vulnerable, to rent it. The owner had the corn cleared within a week, revealing 3 other makeshift camps at different vantage points around the property, each one positioned to watch a different side of the house. I stayed with the Gibsons for 2 weeks, while I arranged to break the lease and find somewhere new to live. A studio apartment in Columbus with a doorman and security cameras, neighbors close enough to hear if I screamed. The landlord tried to keep my security deposit, claiming I'd violated the lease terms, until Diane made a few phone calls and suddenly he was very accommodating, even refunding my last month's rent. Sometimes I Google the address of that farmhouse, checking if anyone new has rented it. So far, it stays empty. The listing photos showing my former bedroom with its big windows, the cleared field behind it looking naked and exposed without the corn. I still wake up some nights, convinced I can hear that patient lifting and releasing of a door, that cheerful humming in the darkness. My therapist says it's normal, that hypervigilance takes time to fade. But I notice things now. How many windows a place has, whether the doors are solid wood or hollow, if there are too many blind spots around a property. And I'll never again ignore those first small signs, those little violations that your mind wants to explain away. Because somewhere out there, he's probably doing it again, picking some other isolated farmhouse, some other woman living alone, starting with cigarette butts and footprints while he learns her routines. Patient and methodical, waiting for the perfect night to finally introduce himself. The cornfield behind the Brennan property stretches for what feels like miles, and during late August of 2022, the stalks stood nearly 8 feet tall, creating these dense walls of green that whispered whenever the wind picked up. I'd driven out there with my girlfriend Jess and our friend group for what was supposed to be just another bonfire before everyone scattered for college again. The Brennans owned about 200 acres of farmland outside Cedar Rapids, and their daughter Allison had been hosting these gatherings since we were 16. That night, there were maybe 12 of us sitting around the fire pit they'd built about 50 yards from where the corn started, passing around cheap beer and talking about nothing important, while sparks drifted up toward the stars. Allison had just turned 19 the week before, and she kept joking about how this might be our last real summer together before adult life swallowed us whole. Around 11 that night, Allison's phone slipped out of her hoodie pocket when she stood up to grab another drink from the cooler, and we all heard it hit something hard before bouncing into the darkness toward the cornfield. She laughed and said she'd be right back, turned on her phone's flashlight using Jess's phone to call hers so it would light up, and walked toward the edge of the corn where we could hear it buzzing. The stalks swallowed her immediately, but we could track her movement by the glow of the flashlight filtering through the corn, and her voice calling out that she could see it, just a little further in. Her friend Kayla was recording some stupid video for Instagram and actually caught Allison disappearing between the rows, this casual moment that would later become evidence. We kept talking and laughing, waiting for her to come back, but after maybe 3 or 4 minutes, her boyfriend Noah called out asking if she needed help, and that's when we realized we couldn't see the flashlight anymore or hear her moving through the stalks. Noah stood up first, cupping his hands around his mouth and shouting her name into the darkness, and the rest of us quickly joined him at the edge of the cornfield, our voices overlapping as we called for Allison. The corn seemed to absorb our shouts, muffling them into nothing, and all we could hear was our own breathing and the constant rustling of leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. 5 of us formed a line and walked into the field together, arms outstretched so we wouldn't lose each other, moving slowly through the rows while calling her name every few seconds. The stalks were so thick that even with our phone flashlights, we could only see maybe 2 feet ahead, and the leaves kept slapping against our faces and arms, leaving these thin scratches that stung with sweat. After 20 minutes of searching, we found her phone lying face down in the dirt between 2 rows. The screen cracked but still glowing with Jess's missed calls. And that's when the real panic set in because Allison would never leave her phone behind, not even as a joke. We spent the next 3 hours searching that field, our voices getting hoarse from screaming her name, stumbling through the endless rows until our phones started dying one by one. Noah was practically hyperventilating, convinced she'd fallen and hit her head somewhere, while Kayla kept insisting we should have heard something, anything, if Allison had gotten hurt or lost. Because sound carries weird in cornfields, but it doesn't just disappear entirely. By 2 in the morning, someone finally convinced Noah to call 911, and within an hour, the place was swarming with sheriff's deputies, volunteer firefighters, and search and rescue teams with powerful floodlights that lit up sections of the field like daylight. They brought in thermal imaging equipment, thinking maybe she'd passed out somewhere in the corn, and 2 different K9 units that both tracked her scent about 30 feet into the field before losing it completely, which the handlers said almost never happens unless someone gets into a vehicle. The Brennans came out in their bathrobes, Allison's mother Claire collapsing against her husband when she realized her daughter wasn't just playing some elaborate prank, and the sound she made was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, this raw wail that seemed to echo across the entire property. When the sun came up around 6 that morning, they had over 50 people walking shoulder to shoulder through the cornfield in a grid pattern, marking each row with orange tape as they cleared it. That's when one of the deputies found the footprints, a single set of bare feet in the soft dirt that started about 40 feet from where we'd found the phone, which made no sense because Allison had been wearing these beat-up Converse sneakers with smiley faces she'd drawn on them in Sharpie. The prints were small, definitely hers based on the size, and they followed this bizarre path through the corn, weaving between rows seemingly at random, before making a sharp turn toward the gravel road that ran along the eastern edge of the property. The detective taking photos kept muttering about how clean the impressions were. No drag marks or signs of struggle. Just deliberate steps from someone who had apparently stopped to take off their shoes in the middle of a cornfield at night for no logical reason. They followed those prints for nearly a quarter mile, past the point where anyone at the bonfire could have possibly heard her, all the way to where the corn ended and the road began. At the edge of the road, the footprints simply stopped, right there in the middle of nothing. No car tracks in the gravel, no signs of anyone else having been there. Just this abrupt end like she'd stepped off the earth entirely. The forensics team photographed every print, measured the stride length, took soil samples, even brought in some specialist from the state police who'd worked missing persons cases for 20 years, and he stood there staring at those last few footprints for almost an hour without saying anything. Later, when the detective interviewed us individually at the station, he kept asking these specific questions about whether Allison had seemed different lately, whether she'd mentioned meeting anyone online, whether she'd ever talked about wanting to disappear, and it was clear they thought she'd planned this somehow. But those of us who knew her understood that was impossible, because Allison had just gotten accepted into the nursing program at the University of Iowa, had already paid her deposit, had spent the whole night talking about her classes starting in 2 weeks, and she'd never, ever leave Noah without at least saying goodbye, not after they'd been together since sophomore year of high school. The thing that haunts me most happened 3 days after she disappeared, when the detective called us back to the station and showed us what they'd recovered from her phone. Most of it was normal stuff, texts about the bonfire, photos from earlier that night. But there was this recording that had started at 11:47 p.m., about 10 minutes after she'd walked into the corn, and it ran for nearly 2 hours before the battery died. The first few minutes were just rustling sounds and her breathing, normal enough, but then the breathing changed, became deeper and more rhythmic, like she was walking with purpose, and you could hear her moving through the corn at a steady pace, never stumbling or stopping to look around. About 30 minutes in, there was this weird moment where the rustling stopped completely for maybe 10 seconds. Total silence except for her breathing, and then it resumed, but with this strange echo quality, like she was in a much larger space than just between corn rows. The detective played it for us on these high-end speakers, and we all heard it, this subtle shift in the acoustic quality that made no sense given where she was supposed to be. The really disturbing part came near the end of the recording, around the 90-minute mark, when you could hear what sounded like Allison humming this tune none of us recognized, just 5 or 6 notes repeated over and over. And her breathing had become so calm, it was almost like she was in some kind of trance. Then right before the phone died, there was this sound that made everyone in that room lean forward. A voice that was definitely Allison's, but speaking in this flat, emotionless tone, saying numbers. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22. Just random numbers with no pattern anyone could figure out. The FBI got involved at that point, running the audio through every kind of analysis, checking those numbers against everything from GPS coordinates to dates to code sequences, but they found nothing that made sense. Noah listened to that recording probably 100 times, convinced there was some message in it, some clue we were missing, until his parents finally made him stop because he wasn't sleeping anymore, just sitting in his room with headphones on, playing those numbers over and over. 2 weeks later, they found her shoes, both of them, placed neatly side by side on the shoulder of Highway 30, almost 15 miles from the Brennan property, sitting there like she'd just stepped out of them to walk barefoot down the asphalt. They were definitely hers, those Converse with the smiley faces, and they were clean. No mud or corn silk or anything that suggested they'd been in that field, which made no sense because we'd all seen her wearing them that night. The laces were still tied in her specific way, this double knot she always did because she hated when they came undone, and inside the left shoe was a receipt from a gas station none of us had ever heard of. time-stamped at 2:47 a.m. the night she disappeared, for a bottle of water and a pack of spearmint gum paid in cash. The detective drove out to that gas station, this little 24-hour place way out on some back road, and the night clerk remembered a girl matching Allison's description coming in around that time, but said she seemed perfectly normal, maybe a little quiet, and that she'd left on foot heading north even though he'd asked if she needed help finding something. What really messed with our heads was the security footage from that gas station, because it clearly showed Allison walking in at 2:46 a.m., barefoot and wearing the same clothes from the bonfire, moving with this strange, purposeful stride like she knew exactly where she was going. She bought the items, had a brief conversation with the clerk where she apparently told him she was going to see the Rose End, whatever that meant, and then walked out and turned north just like he'd said. The camera outside caught her walking along the edge of the road for about 30 seconds before she disappeared into the darkness, and that was the last confirmed sighting of her. The police searched every inch of ground between that gas station and where they'd found her shoes, brought in helicopters with infrared cameras, even drained a pond half a mile away, but found nothing else. No clothing, no footprints, no sign that Allison had ever been anywhere near that stretch of highway. The investigation went on for months, with detectives following every possible lead, interviewing anyone who'd had contact with Allison in the weeks before she disappeared, checking traffic cameras from every intersection within a 50-mile radius, but they never found another trace of her. They discovered she'd been researching weird stuff online in the days before the bonfire, agricultural patterns, and something called liminality in rural spaces, which turned out to be some academic paper about psychological effects of repetitive landscapes like cornfields. But her browser history was otherwise normal, just college stuff and music videos. Her parents hired a private investigator who spent 6 months retracing every step, even brought in some expert on missing persons who'd worked cases all over the Midwest. But he just confirmed what we already knew. People don't just vanish like this, walking barefoot out of a cornfield in the middle of the night with no explanation, no motive, no destination that anyone could identify. The hardest part was watching the Brennans slowly accept that their daughter might never come home, seeing them take down the missing person flyers as they weathered and faded, watching Noah transfer to a different school because he couldn't handle being in Cedar Rapids anymore. The cornfield is still there, though the Brennans don't plant it anymore, just let it go wild with prairie grass and weeds that grow taller each summer until you can barely tell it was ever cultivated land. Sometimes I drive past on my way to visit Jess's parents, and I always slow down at that spot where the field meets the road, wondering if maybe I'll see something everyone else missed, some clue that explains where Allison went that night. The gas station clerk quit his job a few months after she disappeared. Said he kept having dreams about a girl walking north into the darkness, and the new clerk doesn't know anything about it, just shrugs when people ask about the girl who came through that night talking about Rose Ending. Noah sent me a message last month. First time I'd heard from him in over a year, just a simple question. Do you ever hear those numbers in your head? And I knew exactly what he meant because sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I hear Allison's flat voice reciting them. 4, 12, 37, 9, 22, like she's still out there somewhere, walking barefoot through endless rows of corn, following some path only she can see. Jamie always came home at 3:45, give or take 2 minutes. I'd been timing him since the start of the school year, mostly out of boredom while I waited for my shift at the hardware store to start at 5. My younger brother was 14 and predictable as clockwork. You could set your watch by the sound of him kicking off his sneakers on the back porch. October had settled over our part of Illinois with unusual cold that year, and the acres of corn behind our house had turned that particular shade of brown that meant harvest was overdue. That Wednesday, I stood at the kitchen window eating a sandwich, watching the clock tick past 4, then 4:30, and Jamie never showed. Mom was still at the dentist's office where she worked reception, and Dad wouldn't be back from the plant until after 7. By 5:15, I'd already called the school twice, walked the road to check for accidents, and finally forced myself to face what I'd been avoiding. checking the shortcut through the corn that Jamie had been using since 6th grade. My brother treated that field like his personal highway, cutting 20 minutes off his walk home every single day. He knew every deer trail, every irrigation pipe, every spot where the rows opened into small clearings. I found his entry point immediately, the same gap near the rusted fence post where he always ducked in, his handprints visible in the orange rust from years of grabbing it for balance. His footprints were fresh in the soft dirt, those beat-up Converse with the loose heel leaving their familiar marks. I followed them for about 30 yards before backing out and calling 911, trying to keep my voice steady while explaining that my brother hadn't come home. Within an hour, we had 3 sheriff's deputies tramping through our kitchen, tracking mud everywhere while Deputy Coleman explained his theory about spatial disorientation in tall crops. He said it like he was reading from a manual, like Jamie hadn't spent 4 years learning every landmark in those 200 acres, like my brother was some city kid who'd never seen corn before. They searched until midnight that first night, brought in dogs the next morning, even used a drone with thermal imaging on Friday. Nothing. The dogs tracked Jamie's scent for maybe 300 yards into the field before losing it completely, like he'd just vanished into thin air. The handler, a woman named Cheryl with deep wrinkles around her eyes, kept making her German Shepherd go back to the same spot, clearly frustrated that the trail just stopped. She asked me 3 times if there were any old wells or storm cellars in the field, and each time I told her no, just corn and dirt and more corn. The thermal drone picked up plenty of deer, a few coyotes, but no heat signature that could be Jamie. Sheriff Garrett held a press conference on Saturday talking about ongoing search efforts, while basically telling everyone that kids sometimes run away, that the corn made it hard to find anyone, that we needed to consider all possibilities. Mom stopped sleeping after that, just sat at the kitchen table staring at Jamie's school photo, while Dad drove around checking abandoned barns and talking to farmers within a 10-mile radius. By Monday, a week after Jamie disappeared, the official search was scaled back to routine patrols. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore, couldn't stand how everyone was starting to talk about my brother in past tense. That morning, after my parents left, Mom to put up more flyers, Dad to check the bus station in Peoria again, I went back to the field alone. The cops had trampled the original trail, but I knew Jamie's patterns well enough to guess his likely route. He always veered left after entering the field, following a slight ridge that kept his feet drier when the ground was muddy. I pushed through the corn, ignoring how the dry leaves cut at my arms, counting my paces like Jamie had taught me when we were kids playing hide and seek. At around 400 yards in, well past where the dogs had lost his scent, I found something the searchers had missed. A partial footprint, just the toe of his Converse preserved under a fallen cornstalk. The angle was wrong though, like he'd been walking backwards or spinning around, and the dirt around it had strange marks, almost like something had been dragged, but not quite. I kept following the disturbed earth, crawling on my knees now to see under the bent stalks, and that's when I spotted it. Jamie's backpack sitting perfectly upright against a cornstalk like someone had carefully placed it there. Not thrown, not dropped, but set down deliberately with the zippers all closed and the straps adjusted evenly. My brother was messy, always tossing his stuff around, never zipped anything properly in his life. The backpack was clean too, no dirt or moisture on it despite sitting there for a week. Inside, everything was arranged wrong. His textbooks stacked by size, his pencils all facing the same direction in their case, his half-eaten bag of chips folded closed and paper-clipped. Jamie didn't even own paper clips. About 10 feet away, positioned exactly parallel to the corn rows, I found his left shoe. Just one shoe, laces still tied in Jamie's weird double-knot style, but the shoe itself was pristine, like someone had wiped it clean before placing it there. The sock was tucked inside, folded into a perfect little square. The trail of disturbed soil continued for another 20 yards past the shoe, and I followed it, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the wind rattling the corn. The marks in the dirt were deliberate, not random drag patterns, but almost like symbols or letters, though I couldn't make sense of them. They led to a small clearing where several corn stalks had been bent down in a rough circle. their tops woven together overhead to form a kind of shelter or blind. Inside this space, the ground was completely smooth, swept clean of any debris or footprints. In the exact center, someone had dug a shallow depression, maybe 6 inches deep and perfectly round. The extracted dirt formed into a neat ring around it. At the bottom of the depression lay Jamie's student ID card, his house key, and 3 pennies from his pocket, arranged in a triangle. The plastic ID wasn't scratched or dirty. It looked like someone had polished it. But what made me stumble backward was what I saw pressed into the smooth dirt around these items. Dozens of footprints, all from the same shoe, all exactly the same depth, forming a spiral pattern that wound inward to the center. They were Jamie's prints from his right shoe, the one still on his foot. I ran back to the house, crashing through the corn rows without caring about the cuts on my arms, and called Sheriff Garrett directly. This time I had evidence, something concrete they couldn't dismiss as teenage runaway behavior. Garrett himself came out with 2 detectives from the state police, and I led them to the clearing, my legs shaking the whole way. They took photos of everything, bagged the items, made casts of the footprints, but I could see the confusion on their faces. Detective Mills kept asking if I was sure I hadn't touched anything, if maybe Jamie had made this himself as some kind of prank or cry for attention. I wanted to scream at him that Jamie wasn't that kind of kid, that someone had taken my brother and arranged his things like trophies. They brought in a forensics team that afternoon, and that's when things got even stranger. The footprint spiral showed Jamie had walked it at least 30 times, based on the depth and overlap, but there were no other prints anywhere, not even partials. Whoever had been with him had either never touched the ground or had carefully erased their tracks while leaving Jamie's intact. The forensics tech, a young guy named Bradley who looked fresh from college, pulled me aside while the others were documenting the scene. He showed me something on his tablet, enhanced photos of the dirt marks I'd thought might be symbols. Under magnification, they weren't random at all. They were measurements, precise distances marked in the soil, all pointing to different spots in the field. Bradley had mapped them, and they formed a grid pattern extending out from the clearing in perfectly straight lines, each endpoint exactly 150 feet from the center. He asked if Jamie was good at math, if he might have been interested in surveying or geometry. I told him Jamie could barely pass algebra, that he couldn't measure anything without messing it up. Bradley just nodded and went back to the others, but I saw him taking more photos, making notes in a separate notebook he didn't share with the detectives. Before they left, he slipped me a piece of paper with his number, told me to call if I found anything else, anything at all that seemed arranged or measured. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the grid pattern Bradley had shown me. After my parents went to bed, Mom finally knocked out by sleeping pills, Dad passed out on the couch still wearing his work boots. I grabbed a compass and measuring tape from the garage and went back to the field. The moon was nearly full, giving just enough light to navigate between the corn rows without a flashlight that might alert the neighbors. I found the clearing again and started checking Bradley's measurements, following the grid lines out to their endpoints. At the first marker, exactly 150 feet north of the clearing, I found another small depression in the ground, this one containing Jamie's calculator watch, the band cut cleanly in half. The second point to the east had his gym whistle on its lanyard, tied in a complex knot I'd never seen before. Each endpoint had something of Jamie's, all items he would have had with him that day, all placed with the same obsessive precision. The western point made me stop breathing for a full 10 seconds. There, arranged in a perfect line, were Jamie's baby teeth, the ones Mom had saved in a little box in her jewelry drawer. All 12 of them, spaced exactly 1 inch apart, pressed into the soil so only their tops were visible. How could anyone have known about those teeth? How could they have gotten into our house, into Mom's room, without us noticing? I started digging frantically around the teeth, my fingers clawing at the dirt, and about 6 inches down, I hit something solid. It was Jamie's phone, wrapped in clear plastic, the screen still showing his last text to me from that Wednesday. Home in 20, save me some pizza. The battery was dead, but the phone was perfectly clean inside its wrapping, like someone had sealed it away for safekeeping. Underneath the phone, pressed into the clay, was a single adult footprint. Not a shoe print, but a bare foot, with unusually long toes, and what looked like a sixth toe's impression on the left side. The print was deep, deeper than my own when I stood next to it, suggesting someone much heavier despite the narrow shape of the foot. I called Bradley from the field, whispering into my phone while crouched in the corn. He answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting for my call. And when I told him about the baby teeth and the footprint, he went silent for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then he told me to take photos of everything but not to call the sheriff yet. He said he'd been doing some research, checking through old missing persons cases in the area, and he'd found something. 3 other kids had vanished in cornfields over the past 15 years, all within a 50-mile radius, all in October, all between the ages of 12 and 15. The cases had never been connected because they happened in different counties, different jurisdictions, but the pattern was there. Each time the official search found nothing, dogs lost the trail, and the kids were written off as runaways. Bradley had driven out to one of the old sites that afternoon, a field near Effingham that had since been developed into a subdivision. The construction crew had found strange things when they cleared the land, items arranged in geometric patterns, footprints that didn't match any of the workers, and according to one foreman Bradley had tracked down, a complex tunnel system that didn't appear on any survey maps. The southern grid point was the last one I checked, and I almost wished I hadn't. There, in a shallow hole covered with carefully arranged corn husks, was a stack of photographs. They were all of Jamie, taken over the course of months, maybe years. Jamie walking to school, Jamie in our backyard, Jamie through his bedroom window. Some were so recent I recognized the clothes, the shirt he'd worn the previous week, the jacket he'd gotten for his birthday in September. But others were older, showing Jamie at 12, at 10, even one that looked like it was taken when he was maybe 7 or 8, at a school field day I barely remembered. Whoever had taken these had been watching my brother for half his life, had been in our neighborhood, near our house, close enough to photograph him through windows. At the bottom of the stack was a hand-drawn map of our property and the cornfield, marked with dates and times, noting Jamie's routes and routines with terrifying accuracy. The final notation, written in small, precise handwriting, was for that Wednesday, 3:15 p.m., intercept at position 7. Position 7 was marked deep in the field, right around where the dogs had lost Jamie's scent. Bradley arrived at the field 40 minutes later with ground-penetrating radar equipment he'd borrowed from the university. We worked in silence, scanning the area around position 7. And just before dawn, the equipment detected an anomaly, a void about 8 feet underground, extending horizontally for at least 20 feet before the signal degraded. Bradley called in favors, got a full FBI team out there by noon, told them about the pattern of disappearances, the photographs, everything. They brought in excavation equipment, and by evening they'd broken through into a narrow tunnel, hand-dug and reinforced with scavenged materials, leading to a series of small chambers carved from the clay. The smell that came up from that hole, earth and something else, something organic and wrong, made everyone step back. The FBI sent in a robot with a camera first, and when they saw what was down there, they cleared everyone out except essential personnel. They found Jamie alive in the 3rd chamber, semi-conscious and dehydrated but breathing, along with 2 other kids, a girl from Champaign who'd gone missing 3 weeks earlier, and a boy from Decatur whose parents had reported him as a runaway 6 days ago. The man they arrested lived alone in a farmhouse 4 miles away, had worked as a surveyor for the county 20 years ago, before an injury left him on disability. Harold Jenks, 63 years old, 6'4", with a birth defect that gave him an extra toe on his left foot. He'd been using the tunnel system for over a decade, expanding it each year, accessing it through hidden entrances in 3 different cornfields. The FBI found journals in his house, thousands of pages documenting his observations of children, his selection process, his careful planning. He wrote about keeping them underground during the harvest season, when the noise of machinery would mask any sounds, then moving them through the tunnels to different locations, always staying ahead of the searches. Jamie doesn't remember much. Jenks had drugged him with something that affected his memory, made him compliant enough to walk that spiral pattern over and over, while Jenks watched from a blind he'd built in the corn. The other kids had similar gaps in their memories, just fragments of darkness and the sound of corn rustling overhead. Jenks pleaded guilty to avoid trial, got life without parole, and never explained why he did it beyond saying the fields told him to. Jamie came home after a week in the hospital, physically okay but different, quieter. He hasn't walked through a cornfield since, takes the long way to school now, stays on the sidewalks and paved roads. The field behind our house was harvested that November, and Dad convinced the owner to plant soybeans the next year, then wheat, anything but corn. We never talk about it, but sometimes I catch Jamie staring out his bedroom window at where the cornfield used to be, and I wonder what he's remembering, what fragments of those dark hours underground still surface in his dreams. The fence posts stretched for miles across that Nebraska property, each one needing new wire, or a complete replacement after the spring storms had torn through. I'd been picking up mechanic work at a shop in Omaha for about 6 months, when Jerry, one of the regulars, mentioned his uncle needed someone handy for a week-long job out in the country. The pay was double what I was making, cash up front, plus room and board at the farmhouse. My beat-up Chevy truck needed new tires and the rent was overdue, so I loaded my tools that Sunday morning and drove 3 hours west into nowhere. The land out there was different than anything I'd seen growing up near Denver, just endless fields of corn already standing 7 feet tall in early July, broken only by gravel roads that seemed to lead nowhere special. Walter Hoffman turned out to be somewhere past 70, with fingers bent from arthritis, and a way of squinting at you like he was trying to read fine print. His farmhouse sat alone on 800 acres, the nearest neighbor a good 4 miles down the county road. He showed me to a small room above the garage, just a mattress and a dresser that smelled like motor oil, then walked me along the fence line that needed fixing. The corn grew right up to the posts in most places, leaving these narrow corridors where I'd have to work, barely wide enough to swing a hammer. Walter said he'd planted late this year because of the rain, and the stalks were growing fast in the heat, already thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few feet into the rows. He'd leave me alone during the day, he explained, since his hip made walking hard, but dinner would be ready at 6 sharp in the main house. The first 3 days went smooth enough, just me and the fence posts under that Nebraska sun, sweat dripping while I hammered new boards and stretched wire until my arms burned. The only sounds were the meadowlarks calling from somewhere beyond the corn and this constant rustling the wind made pushing through all those leaves. Sometimes I'd catch myself stopping work just to listen to it, that ocean sound of thousands of stalks swaying together, almost hypnotic if you let it get to you. Around Wednesday afternoon, I was working a section near the back of the property when I heard something else mixed in with that rustling. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, moving through the rows about 20 yards from where I was kneeling with my pliers. I stood up and called out, thinking maybe Walter had walked out to check on my progress, but the footsteps stopped immediately, leaving just that endless whisper of corn moving in the breeze. That night at dinner, I asked Walter if anyone else ever came through the property, maybe hunters or kids from town looking for trouble. He stopped cutting his pork chop and gave me that squinting look again, like I'd asked something peculiar. Nobody had any business being on his land, he said, and nobody from town would drive all the way out here just to walk through corn. The way he said it made me feel stupid for asking, so I dropped it and focused on my plate. But when I was walking back to my room above the garage, I noticed how complete the darkness was out there. No streetlights, no house lights except Walter's windows, just stars and the massive shadow of the cornfield surrounding everything. My truck sat parked by the garage, and on impulse I tried starting it just to hear the engine. But when I turned the key, nothing happened except a clicking sound from under the hood. The battery was dead, completely drained even though I'd just driven it 3 days ago without any problems. I popped the hood with my phone flashlight since the garage had no overhead light, and everything looked normal. No loose cables, no corrosion on the terminals. I figured I'd ask Walter for a jump in the morning, but when I checked my phone to set an alarm, The screen showed no signal bars at all. Not even one. I'd had at least 2 bars the first day, enough to text my roommate that I'd arrived safely. Now the phone was basically a brick, useless except as a flashlight. Standing there between my dead truck and that wall of corn just 30 feet away, I felt this weight settle in my chest, like when you realize you've made a mistake but can't quite name what it is yet. The corn rustled louder in the night breeze, and I swear I heard those same measured footsteps again, closer this time, maybe just inside the first row of stalks. Friday morning came with fog so thick I couldn't see the cornfield from my window, just white mist pressed against the glass like cotton. I found Walter in his kitchen already drinking coffee, and when I mentioned my truck trouble, he said his battery charger had broken last month, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. The nearest auto parts store was in town, 40 minutes away, and he couldn't drive me there until Monday, when he did his supply run. 3 more days stuck here. I asked about using his landline to call someone, maybe Jerry back in Omaha, but Walter said the phone lines went down in the last storm, and the phone company hadn't come out yet. His words made sense, but something in his tone felt rehearsed, like he'd been expecting these exact questions. I spent that day working the fence, but now every sound from the corn made me stop and stare into those green walls, trying to see between the stalks. That Friday night changed everything. I was lying on the mattress above the garage, windows open because the heat was suffocating when I heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't staying in the corn. They were moving along the fence line I'd been repairing, slow and deliberate, occasionally stopping right where I'd been working hours before. I crept to the window and looked down, but the darkness was absolute beyond the small circle of light from Walter's porch bulb. Then I heard the fence wire snap, that distinct metallic twang of tension releasing, followed by another snap, then another. Someone was cutting through my work, destroying what I'd spent days fixing. I grabbed my phone for light and rushed downstairs, but by the time I reached the fence, the footsteps had retreated back into the corn. 3 sections of new wire hung loose, cleanly cut with what must have been wire cutters. The cuts were precise, deliberate, not random vandalism, but something purposeful. Walter barely looked up from his eggs when I told him Saturday morning about the cut fence. "Kids from town," he said, probably the same ones who'd been stealing gas from farms all summer. But his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee mug, and I noticed he kept glancing toward the windows that faced the cornfield. I spent the morning repairing the damaged sections, jumping at every rustle, every bird call. Around noon, I decided to walk the perimeter of the property, looking for tire tracks or footprints, anything that might explain who was doing this. The corn rows ran along 3 sides of Walter's land, with only the front facing the county road clear. As I walked along the eastern edge, where the stalks grew thickest, I found something that made me stop cold. A narrow path cut into the corn, barely visible unless you were looking straight at it. The stalks had been carefully pushed aside, not broken, creating a tunnel that disappeared into the green darkness. Fresh boot prints marked the entrance, the treads still sharp in the dry soil. I stood at that entrance for a long time, listening to the corn move around me, trying to convince myself to follow that path and see where it led. But something primal in my gut screamed against it. Whoever made that trail knew these fields, had probably been using them for weeks or months, maybe longer. They could be waiting in there just far enough and where the light barely reached, watching the entrance. Instead, I backed away and continued my circuit around the property, finding 2 more hidden paths cut into different sections of the field. All of them angled toward the house and garage, like spokes on a wheel with Walter's buildings at the center. That afternoon, I confronted Walter directly, told him about the paths, said someone was definitely living or hiding in his corn. His face went pale, almost gray, and he gripped the kitchen table hard enough that his knuckles went white. Then he told me something that made everything worse. The corn wasn't his. He'd leased those fields to a company 5 years ago, some agricultural outfit from Kansas City, and they planted and harvested without his involvement. He had no idea who worked those fields or when they came through. Saturday night, I barricaded myself in the room above the garage, pushing the dresser against the door and keeping a hammer within reach. Sleep was impossible. Every sound became footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like breathing. Around midnight, I heard voices, low, muffled, but definitely human, coming from somewhere near the garage. I pressed my ear to the floor and could make out at least 2 different speakers, maybe 3, but couldn't understand the words. They were directly below me in the garage with my dead truck. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then footsteps scattered in different directions, some heading back toward the corn, others moving toward the main house where Walter slept. I watched from my window as a shadow passed through the porch light's glow, tall, wearing what looked like coveralls, carrying something long in one hand. The figure stopped at Walter's front door, stood there for a full minute, then walked back toward the cornfield, disappearing into one of those hidden paths. Sunday morning, Walter wasn't in the kitchen at his usual time. I found him sitting on his porch, staring at the cornfield with hollow eyes, looking like he hadn't slept at all. When I sat down beside him, he started talking without prompting, his voice barely above a whisper. The company that leased his fields, he said. They'd stopped sending checks 2 years ago, stopped answering his calls, but people still came to work the corn. Different people each season, arriving in unmarked vans, never talking to him, never asking permission. He'd tried calling the police once, but the sheriff said without proof of trespassing or crime, there was nothing to investigate. The workers had keys to the equipment shed behind the corn, legal access roads through neighboring properties. Walter suspected they were growing more than corn in those fields, using the dense rows to hide other activities. Maybe drugs, maybe worse. He'd been too scared to look closer, too old to fight back, so he just stayed in his house and pretended not to notice when they came through at night. I told Walter we were leaving immediately, both of us that morning. We could walk to the county road and flag down a car if we had to. But he shook his head, said they'd never let us leave on foot, not in daylight when they could see us from the corn. Our only chance was his truck Monday morning, acting like nothing was wrong, like it was just his regular supply run. Until then, we had to play along, pretend we didn't know anything. That Sunday crawled by in suffocating tension, both of us going through the motions, me pretending to work on the fence, Walter puttering around his yard, both of us avoiding looking at the corn even as we felt eyes watching from within. As darkness fell, Walter handed me his truck keys and an old revolver he'd kept hidden. Only 3 bullets left in the cylinder. He told me to be ready at dawn, to get to his truck fast when he gave the signal. We'd make a run for town and never come back. That night they came for my truck. I watched from my window as 4 figures emerged from different paths in the corn, converging on the garage below. They worked in complete silence, no talking, just efficient movement as they pushed my truck out of the garage and down toward the cornfield. They were taking it somewhere into those rows, probably to strip it for parts or hide it where no one would ever find it. One of them looked up at my window before they disappeared, just stood there staring at where I was hiding behind the curtain, making sure I knew they knew exactly where I was. I gripped Walter's revolver tighter and waited for them to come upstairs, but after a few minutes the figure turned and followed the others into the corn. The message was clear. We were allowed to leave in the morning, but only because they decided to let us go. They owned this place now, not Walter, and everyone involved understood the terms. Monday came with a blood-red sunrise that painted the corn stalks orange. Walter was already in his truck when I sprinted from the garage, expecting someone to emerge from the fields at any moment. But nothing moved except the corn swaying in the morning breeze. We drove down that gravel drive faster than was safe, dust clouding behind us, neither of us speaking until we hit the paved county road. Walter drove straight to the state police station in Grand Island, told them everything while I sat there still clutching his revolver in my jacket pocket. The cops sent units out that afternoon, but they found nothing. No paths in the corn, no footprints, no sign of my truck. Even the cut fence wires had been replaced with new ones. The detective said without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. Walter sold the farm 2 months later to some development company from out of state, took whatever they offered and moved to Arizona to live with his daughter. I never got my truck back, never got paid for the fence work either. Sometimes I search online for news about that area of Nebraska, looking for stories about drug busts or missing persons found in cornfields, but there's never anything. Whatever they were doing out there in those endless rows, they're probably still doing it now, using some other old farmer's land, watching from the corn. October brings out the worst in people, and after working at Frightland Farms for 6 weeks, I thought I'd seen it all. College was draining my bank account faster than my parents predicted, so when I saw the Help Wanted sign for the corn maze back in September, $30 an hour seemed too good to pass up. The maze sprawled across 12 acres of farmland just outside Bakersfield, with walls of corn stalks reaching 8 feet high, and paths that twisted into dead ends designed to make visitors panic. My job was simple enough. Reset the motion-activated props between tours, guide lost families to the exit, and make sure nobody vandalized the animatronic scarecrows. That particular Saturday night, we'd run 7 tours back-to-back, each one packed with screaming teenagers and drunk adults who thought jumping out at other guests was hilarious. By the time we locked the main gate at midnight, my ears were ringing from all the chainsaw sound effects, and dried corn silk had worked its way into every piece of clothing I wore. The parking lot emptied out quickly after closing, leaving just 3 cars: mine, the manager Keith's pickup truck, and a sedan that belonged to Vicky from concessions. Keith had asked me and 2 other guys to stay late for breakdown duty, promising an extra $50 cash if we helped haul the expensive decorations into storage before the rain forecasted for Sunday morning. Most of the electronic stuff needed to come down first: the strobe lights, fog machines, and those motion sensors that triggered recorded screams whenever someone walked past. The other guys started at the entrance while I headed toward the back sections with a wheelbarrow and my phone flashlight, since the overhead lights would shut off automatically at 12:30 to save electricity. The corn rustled in the wind, creating whispers that made me jumpy even though I knew every inch of these paths. I'd just disconnected the zombie mannequin at checkpoint 4 when the first section of lights went dark, way earlier than scheduled. Then the second section cut out, and the third like someone was flipping breakers in sequence, leaving me stranded in complete darkness, with nothing but my phone's weak beam cutting through the shadows. "Keith," I called out, expecting to hear his gravelly voice boom back from the entrance, but nothing came except the sound of corn stalks brushing against each other. The generator should have kicked in by now. We had backup power specifically for situations like this, installed after some kids got lost in the dark 2 years ago, and their parents threatened to sue. I tried calling Keith's cell, but the screen showed no signal, which wasn't unusual since reception was spotty out here, but the timing made my chest tight. That's when I heard it, a voice answering from somewhere deep in the maze, muffled by the walls of corn but definitely human. "Yeah, coming," it said, but something was wrong with the tone, too high-pitched to be Keith, too cheerful for anyone who'd just worked a 12-hour shift. The voice had that fake quality actors use when they're trying too hard to sound casual, like someone reading lines for the first time. I aimed my phone toward where the sound came from, but the light barely penetrated 5 feet before the darkness swallowed it whole. My first instinct was to head back toward the entrance, but the path behind me looked identical to the one ahead, just walls of corn pressing in from both sides. We'd designed the maze to disorient people during daylight hours, and now, in pitch darkness with my phone battery at 30%, every turn looked the same. Another sound cut through the rustling, and this time it was definitely laughter. Not from the speakers we'd installed at corner posts, but from somewhere between the rows, like someone was standing just behind the corn wall next to me. The laugh had that unhinged quality drunk people get when they think they're being funny, but they're really just being creepy, drawn out, and ending in a wheeze. "Real hilarious, guys," I shouted, figuring it was probably Brett and Miguel trying to mess with me, but my voice cracked halfway through. The laughter stopped immediately, replaced by footsteps, not on the packed dirt paths, but pushing through the corn itself, snapping stalks as whoever it was forced their way through the walls instead of using the maze routes. The wheelbarrow I'd been pushing sat abandoned behind me somewhere, and I couldn't remember which checkpoint I'd passed last. Every horror movie I'd ever watched screamed at me not to investigate, to just run. But running blind through a maze designed to trap people seemed equally stupid. My phone flashlight started flickering, not dying completely but stuttering like a strobe light, which made the shadows between the corn rows jump and dance. During one of the dark moments, I caught a glimpse of something pale moving parallel to me through the stalks, keeping pace but never quite showing itself fully. The smell hit me then, not the earthy scent of corn and soil I'd gotten used to, but something chemical and wrong, like rubber burning mixed with that sickly sweet stench of spilled energy drinks. Whoever this was had been here a while, maybe since before we opened for the evening tours, waiting in some corner we never checked. The thought made bile rise in my throat because we'd had hundreds of people walk through here tonight, including families with little kids, and this person had been watching the whole time. I forced myself to think logically about the maze layout. The exit was always northeast from any point. That's how we'd mapped it for emergency situations. But without the overhead lights or the glowing arrows we put up for the younger kids' tours, northeast meant nothing. The footsteps had stopped, which somehow felt worse than hearing them because now I had no idea where the person was. Then my phone started ringing, the sound impossibly loud in the silence, Keith's name lighting up the screen. Relief flooded through me as I answered, but the voice that came through wasn't Keith's. "Having fun yet?" the same high-pitched voice from earlier asked, and I realized with cold certainty that whoever was in here with me had Keith's phone. The line went dead before I could respond, and when I looked at my screen, my battery had dropped to 20%, even though it had been at 30 just minutes ago. The corn to my left suddenly parted, stalks bending outward like something large was pushing through, and I saw fingers, too long with dirt caked under the nails, reaching through the gap toward where I stood. I stumbled backward and ran, not caring anymore about finding the exit, just needing to put distance between me and those reaching fingers. The maze paths forked and twisted, and I took turns at random, my breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed off the corn walls. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not running but walking steadily, calmly, like whoever it was knew exactly where I would end up. They started whistling, the tune familiar but wrong, like a children's song played in a minor key. My phone light caught a reflection ahead, metal gleaming in the darkness, and I recognized one of our emergency exit signs, the ones we installed after the lawsuit threat. The gate was padlocked, of course, but the fence was only 6 feet high, chain link that I could climb if I could just reach it. 20 more yards, 15, 10, and then something wrapped around my ankle, sending me sprawling face first into the dirt path. When I rolled over, gasping and spitting out soil, I saw what had tripped me. A foam machete from one of our props, but attached to it was a note written in what looked like brown marker. "You walked past me 17 times tonight." The whistling had stopped, and in the sudden quiet, I heard something that made my situation infinitely worse. Multiple voices, at least 3, maybe 4, all whispering in unison from different parts of the maze. They were coordinating, I realized, using the paths to herd me towards something. My phone finally died, plunging me into absolute darkness just as I heard the chain link fence rattle somewhere to my right. They were climbing it, blocking my escape route. The whispering grew louder and I could make out words now. Section 3 clear. He's moving toward checkpoint 7. Block the maintenance gate. These weren't random creeps who'd hidden after hours. They'd studied our maze, learned our procedures, maybe even taken one of our employee maps from the break room. The smell was stronger now, and I realized why it seemed familiar. It was the same combination of smells from the storage unit where we kept the old decorations, the ones from 5 years ago when an employee named Curtis had disappeared during breakdown and never been found. We joked about it sometimes, called it the Curtis curse, but right now, crouched in the dirt with strangers surrounding me, I wondered if maybe Curtis hadn't disappeared at all. The ground beneath me vibrated slightly, and I heard the unmistakable sound of our industrial wood chipper starting up somewhere near the maintenance shed. We used it to mulch the corn stalks after the season ended, but hearing it now, in the dark with these people hunting me, sent ice through my veins. They weren't just trying to scare me. They had access to our equipment, knew where we kept the keys. A flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness about 50 feet away, sweeping back and forth methodically. And in its glow, I saw a figure wearing one of our employee uniforms from years ago. The old green ones we'd replaced with red ones 3 seasons back. The person holding the light was tall, skeletal thin, with hair that hung in greasy strands over their face. When they turned slightly, I caught a glimpse of their smile, too wide, showing too many teeth like they'd been practicing it in a mirror but couldn't quite get it right. "Found you," they sang out in that high-pitched voice, and 2 more flashlights clicked on from different directions, forming a triangle with me at the center. Something inside me snapped then, not breaking but hardening into pure survival instinct. I grabbed handful after handful of dirt and started throwing it at the nearest flashlight, then dove through the corn wall to my left, not caring about the stalks cutting my face and arms. The corn rows weren't planted in perfect lines. There were gaps if you knew where to look, spaces where the irrigation system created natural corridors. I'd spent 6 weeks learning every inch of this place, and now that knowledge was the only thing keeping me alive. Behind me, I heard them crashing through the corn, no longer coordinated, angry now. The wood chipper's sound grew louder as I headed toward it, which seemed insane, but I remembered something. The maintenance shed had a landline, an old phone that connected directly to the security company. If I could get there first, if I could lock myself in and make that call, maybe I'd survive this. The shed appeared in the darkness, a darker shadow against the night sky, and I could see the door was open, swinging slightly in the wind. The smart thing would be to avoid it, to know it was a trap, but I could hear them getting closer, and the sound of the wood chipper meant someone was already there, waiting. I burst through the shed door and immediately saw Keith, tied to a chair with orange extension cords, duct tape over his mouth, his eyes wide with terror, but alive. The wood chipper sat in the corner, running empty, just making noise to lure me here. Before I could move toward Keith, the door slammed shut behind me, and the skeletal figure stepped out from behind a stack of fertilizer bags. Up close, I could see their face clearly. Hollow cheeks, eyes that didn't blink enough, and that horrible smile that looked carved into their face. "You lasted longer than Curtis," they said in that sing-song voice, pulling something from their pocket that gleamed silver in the dim light from the emergency exit sign. It was a set of keys, car keys, house keys, and smaller keys I recognized as the ones from our employee lockers. Dozens of sets, all on different rings, some rusty, some new, and I understood with sickening clarity that Curtis wasn't there first, and I wouldn't be there last. They took a step toward me, and I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a canister of pesticide spray we used for wasp nests. The label warned about eye contact, about permanent damage, about keeping away from open flames, and I remembered the lighter in my pocket from my smoke break 6 hours ago, back when my biggest worry was a statistics midterm. What happened next took maybe 10 seconds, but I can still see every detail when I close my eyes. I sprayed the pesticide directly at their face while flicking the lighter with my other hand, creating a makeshift flamethrower that sent them stumbling backward, screaming in a voice that finally sounded human. The others burst through the door just as the pesticide canister emptied, and in the chaos, I managed to cut Keith free with a box cutter from the workbench. We ran toward his truck while they tried to help their leader, whose face was a mess of chemical burns and singed hair. Keith's hands shook so badly I had to dig the keys from his pocket myself, and we peeled out of there, gravel spraying, while 3 figures stood in the parking lot watching us go. The police found evidence of at least 12 different people who'd gone missing from corn mazes across 3 states over the past 8 years, all during the Halloween season. They arrested 4 people living in an abandoned farmhouse 2 miles from Frightland Farms, and during the trial, we learned they'd been employees at various mazes over the years, learning layouts, studying procedures, choosing victims who stayed late. The wood chipper had been cleaned with bleach so many times the metal was pitted, but forensics still found traces. I finished college, got my degree, moved to Portland where there's no farmland for miles, but every October when the leaves change and people start decorating for Halloween, I smell that mixture of burnt rubber and energy drinks, and I remember those fingers reaching through the corn. The Corn Maze Festival had always been the highlight of autumn in our town. Families came from neighboring counties to eat fried dough, take hay rides, and get lost among the tall golden rows that stretched beyond the church steeple. I helped with parking that year, waving cars toward the muddy field behind the grain silo. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend. Warm cider, local bands, kids running with flashlights through the stalks. No one imagined that before the night was over, a 17-year-old named Tyler Green would vanish without a trace. I remember hearing his name for the first time over the loudspeaker. The announcer's voice cracked halfway through, like he did not quite believe what he was saying. People laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. Tyler had entered the maze around 6 in the evening with 3 friends, and by dusk, he had separated from them. They assumed he went out another exit, but when the fireworks started at 9, his parents realized he was not anywhere near the crowd. That is when the panic began to spread through the fairgrounds, quiet at first, like wind stirring the stalks before a storm. By midnight, the sheriff's deputies had blocked the roads leading to the farms, and volunteers were forming lines at the edge of the maze. I joined them, holding a lantern borrowed from my father's shed. The smell of wet earth and gasoline filled the air. Every few yards, someone shouted Tyler's name, and the sound was swallowed by the corn. Flashlights danced through the fog, catching glimpses of scarecrows, boots half buried in mud, and once, a child's lost mitten that made a woman scream before realizing it was pink, not blue like Tyler's. The search stretched into the early hours, and the field began to feel endless. When the sun rose, we saw how far we had wandered. The maze sat between 3 farms, their property lines marked by rusted wire and piles of rotting hay. A man named Roger Jenkins brought coffee in a thermos and pointed to tire tracks near the drainage ditch. He said they were fresh, still pressed deep into the mud from the night before. The sheriff crouched beside them, tracing the pattern with a stick, and his face tightened. Word spread fast that the tread matched a pickup belonging to Tyler's neighbor, a quiet mechanic named Paul Hewitt. By noon, no one was talking about an accident anymore. The sheriff questioned Paul right there at the field, his wife standing behind him, arms folded tight against the morning chill. Paul kept saying he had gone home early, that his truck had not left the driveway since supper time. But everyone in town knew his tires. He used a distinctive snow tread year-round, claiming it gave him better traction in mud. While deputies searched his property, the rest of us stayed behind, combing through the maze row by row. Around mid-afternoon, one of the volunteer teams radioed that they had found a roll of duct tape half buried under a pile of stalks. It looked like it had been torn in a hurry, silver edges still sticky with dirt and grass. After that, everything changed. The fairgrounds that had been filled with chatter went dead silent, except for the sound of engines starting as more people joined the search. The duct tape was placed in a plastic bag and carried toward the sheriff's car like it was made of glass. A deputy muttered something about fingerprints and another pointed toward a broken flashlight lying a few yards away. Someone swore they had seen that same brand in Paul's garage last week. By then, everyone's face had turned pale, and whispers replaced words. It felt as if the entire town was holding its breath, afraid of what would come next. Later that evening, the sky turned a strange amber color, the kind you see before heavy rain. The wind made the corn hiss and shift, creating shapes that looked like people moving between the rows. We kept walking in lines, calling Tyler's name, but it started to sound meaningless. Some of the older men brought dogs, though the animals refused to go near the northern edge of the field. That was where we found the torn piece of blue fabric caught on a barbed wire fence. It matched the color of the hoodie Tyler had been wearing. The air around us felt heavy, and no one said a word as the sheriff wrapped it in another evidence bag. When night came again, the searchlights turned the field into a sea of shadows. The sheriff ordered everyone back to the fairgrounds to regroup, but a few of us stayed behind near the drainage ditch, where the tire marks had been found. That was when Roger noticed something in the water, a small silver chain tangled around a branch. It had a pendant shaped like a baseball, and Tyler's mother confirmed later that it belonged to him. The sheriff looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. He said they would start digging near the ditch at first light. I went home that night muddy to my knees, but I could not bring myself to wash my boots. When dawn came, the air was thick with fog. Deputies marked off a wide area near the ditch and brought in shovels. A local news van arrived, its camera catching every movement. I stood behind the barrier tape with a few others, unable to leave. After about 20 minutes, one of the deputies called for the sheriff. They had uncovered something wrapped in a tarp, small, dark, and unmistakably human-shaped. The sheriff told the reporters to turn off their cameras, but everyone already knew. A woman behind me began sobbing, and someone else yelled that Paul should be dragged out of his house that instant. Paul was taken into custody that afternoon, though no one saw the evidence they had against him. His wife packed their belongings that same evening and drove away without saying goodbye to anyone. For a few weeks, the town lived in a fog of suspicion. Neighbors stopped talking to each other. Parents refused to let their kids walk alone, and even the church potluck was canceled. The sheriff said the investigation was still ongoing, but no charges were ever filed. People whispered that something about the evidence did not add up, that the tire marks might have been a coincidence. Still, no one dared to question the official story too loudly. Months passed, and the cornfields grew bare again. The festival was canceled the following year, replaced by a simple memorial service near the ditch. I stood there, watching the wind move through the dry stalks, and realized how quiet everything had become. It was not just grief. It was fear. Fear that someone still among us had done it. Fear that we might never really know. Sometimes when I drive past that field at night, I see flashlights flickering between the rows, like the search never ended. I know they are not real, but I still slow down and watch them until they fade. I have not been back since. The field was sold to a developer last spring, and they say new houses will be built where the maze once stood. People like to believe that time heals, but in our town it only buried what we could not face. Every autumn, when the air smells like wet hay and smoke, I think of Tyler, his blue hoodie, the pendant in the ditch, the silence that followed. None of us talk about it anymore, but every one of us remembers the night the search began, and the morning we wished we had never found what we were looking for. It happened during my senior year, after one of our late fall soccer practices. The days were already short, and by the time the bus left the school parking lot, the sky had that bruised purple color that means the sun is almost gone. There were 12 of us, plus our driver, Mr. Daly, a quiet man who always had an old thermos of coffee that smelled like burnt toast. Everyone was tired, still in our uniforms, our shoes muddy, music playing low from someone's speaker near the back. It felt like any other ride home, except for the route, a detour through a narrow road that cut between cornfields because of roadwork near town. About 20 minutes in, the engine made this coughing sound, and the whole bus shuddered like it had hiccups. Mr. Daly tried to restart it, but after a few attempts, it just went silent. The air inside turned heavy, no hum of the motor, only the whisper of wind against the windows and the tall corn brushing along the sides. He told us to stay put while he went to look for help, said there was a farmhouse not far down the road. He grabbed his jacket, stepped out, and the door's pneumatic hiss was the last clear sound before everything felt strangely hollow. We waited, maybe 10 minutes at first, then 20. The light outside kept fading until all we could see through the glass was the dull reflection of ourselves and a thin stripe of orange horizon. Someone cracked a joke about ghosts in the corn to break the tension, but it didn't land. One of the younger students, Ellie, started recording on her phone, trying to capture how creepy the field looked, just rows of stalks waving in the wind. The video's still online, I think, but the last part is what got people talking, because after the laughter faded, there were footsteps, not Mr. Daly's, slower, uneven, circling the bus. At first we thought maybe it was him, or someone from the farmhouse he mentioned, but when Ellie called out, there was no reply. Just that rhythm of steps shifting through the dirt, stopping, then starting again from a different side. The kind of sound that doesn't match any pattern you recognize. Someone tried to use their phone flashlight to look outside, but the glare bounced off the glass, and it only made things worse. like we were trapped in our own reflection. That was when we heard the first tap on the side panel, light but deliberate near the emergency exit window. The tapping came again, this time closer to where we sat. It was faint, like the tip of a coin against metal, but steady enough that no one spoke over it. Someone whispered that maybe the wind was moving the stalks, but there was no wind strong enough to make that sound. Then came a scrape, long, dragging, along the length of the bus. It traveled slowly, almost as if whoever or whatever was outside was testing each panel. A few of us stood up and tried to look through the windows on that side, but it was useless. The corn was too dense, and everything beyond the glass looked like shifting shadows. Ellie stopped recording when the sound reached the back door. Her phone light flickered once, and I remember her face going pale in that dim glow. Mr. Daly had been gone nearly 40 minutes by then. We tried to convince ourselves that he was just lost, that maybe he had gone the wrong way down the road. One of the older boys, Ethan, said we should go find him, but nobody wanted to step outside first. It was strange. None of us said we were scared, but nobody moved either. The silence between us said everything. At some point, a pair of headlights appeared far down the road, faint but real. Everyone rushed to the front thinking help had come, but the lights never got closer. They just hovered there, distant and still, like whoever was driving had stopped in the middle of the road. When they finally blinked out, it felt like the night got heavier. The air turned colder inside the bus, though none of the windows were open. I could smell something faint then, wet dirt and something like rust. That was when the footsteps returned, faster this time, circling again. But there were more of them, too many. It sounded like a crowd walking through the field just out of sight, moving in patterns that made no sense. The rhythm of it built until the sound was coming from both sides, and a low voice, maybe 2 or 3 of them, started whispering our names. Not all of us, just a few. Mine was one of them. No one said anything after that. We just sat there, waiting until someone at the back said they saw a light inside the corn rows. The light was small, maybe the size of a lantern, weaving between the stalks as if someone was carrying it low. We all crowded toward the windows, but the glass fogged with our breath. I remember wiping it clear with my sleeve and seeing the light stop halfway to the bus. Then another one appeared behind it, and another, 3 in total, flickering like weak flashlights. For a moment, we were sure it was Mr. Daly bringing help, and the relief hit all at once, until one of the lights started moving upward, high above the corn, like it was floating. The other 2 stayed still. The laughter we expected never came. No voices. Just that steady shuffle of footsteps drawing closer again. Someone yelled that we needed to get out. Panic spread quick. Ethan pulled the emergency lever, and cold air rushed in with the smell of soil and something metallic. We climbed down one by one, our sneakers sinking into the soft dirt. The field surrounded us on every side, the corn towering higher than our heads. The bus lights flickered once behind us, then went dark. Nobody said a word after that. It was as if sound itself didn't want to exist out there. The only thing we could hear was breathing, ours, and something else pacing in rhythm just beyond the rows. When the police found me, it was already morning. I was sitting in the middle of the road, wrapped in one of those silver rescue blankets, staring at the spot where the bus had been. They said they found it a mile away, engine still cold, door open, no one inside. Every other student was gone. The only thing left was Ellie's phone wedged under one of the seats. They played part of the last recording for me later. Those footsteps, the low whisper, and then what sounded like wind passing through the microphone before it cuts off completely. I wish I could tell you more, but I do not remember anything after running into the corn. To this day, no one has found the others, not even a piece of clothing or a footprint beyond the road. The official report says the bus rolled down a slope and got stuck, that the kids must have wandered off in confusion. But I still hear it sometimes when I drive past empty fields at dusk, the same rhythm of steps brushing through dry stalks, circling, waiting. The sound follows the car for a while, then fades when the light is gone. That night feels like it never ended, like part of me is still sitting on that bus, watching those 3 lights sway in the dark. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Everyone in our small Nebraska town knew me as the guy who inherited the family cattle farm after Dad passed in 2018. 60 acres wasn't much compared to the big operations, but it kept me busy enough, especially during calving season when I needed extra hands. I just turned 31 that spring, still learning the ropes of running the whole operation solo, juggling the books and the actual farming, when I put out word at the feed store that I needed temporary help. Most locals already had their own work, so I wasn't surprised when the only person who showed up was someone nobody recognized, a man who said he'd been working farms down in Kansas and was heading north for the summer. His name was Carl Brennan, and right away I noticed how he barely made eye contact when we talked. Not in a shifty way, more like he was just deeply uncomfortable with people, which honestly wasn't that unusual for farm hands passing through. He had rough, calloused hands that told me he knew work, and when I showed him around the property that first day in early May, he seemed most interested in the back 40 acres where we had a large pond surrounded by thick woods. The cattle rarely went back there since we had water tanks closer to the barn, so I mentioned it was pretty much just wildlife habitat, maybe needed some fence maintenance along the tree line. Carl just nodded, said he could handle whatever needed doing, and asked if he could park his old camper van near the equipment shed. For the first couple weeks, Carl was exactly what I needed. He showed up before sunrise, worked steady through the heat of the day, and never complained about anything I asked him to do. He fixed fences faster than any hired help I'd had before, had a good sense for handling the cattle without spooking them, and even repaired some equipment I'd been meaning to get to for months. But I started noticing he spent every lunch break walking back toward that pond area, always carrying a small backpack, always alone. When I asked if he was fishing back there, he just shrugged and said he liked the quiet, needed to clear his head away from the noise of the farm equipment. By the third week, I began seeing things that made me uneasy, though I kept telling myself I was being paranoid about a good worker. Carl would come back from his lunch breaks with fresh scratches on his arms, and sometimes his face, deep ones that looked like they'd come from thorns or branches. When I mentioned he should be careful in those woods, maybe wear longer sleeves, he got this strange look and said he knew what he was doing, that he'd been dealing with wild areas his whole life. He started getting territorial about that section of the property too, always volunteering to check the fence lines back there before I even asked, always insisting he could handle any maintenance around the pond by himself. One afternoon in late May, my neighbor Tom stopped by to return a tool he'd borrowed, and we got to talking by the barn. Carl was working on a tractor nearby, but when Tom mentioned how his daughter and her friend had gone missing from a town about 40 miles south last month, I saw Carl's whole body go rigid. He dropped the wrench he was holding, and when it clanged on the concrete, he flinched like someone had fired a gun. Tom didn't notice, kept talking about how the girl's car was found abandoned on a rural road. No sign of them anywhere, but I watched Carl gather his tools and walk quickly toward his van without saying a word. That night, I heard his van engine start around midnight, saw the headlights sweep across my bedroom window as he drove off, but the next morning he was back working like nothing had happened. I started paying closer attention after that, maybe checking on him more than I should have. Found out he always paid for everything in cash at the feed store, never used the local diner where most farm workers grabbed breakfast, and nobody had seen him anywhere in town except for buying supplies. When I casually asked where in Kansas he'd worked before, he got defensive, said it was a small operation near the Oklahoma border, nobody I'd know, and changed the subject immediately. He'd been with me about a month when I decided to walk back to the pond myself one evening after he'd left, just to see what he was doing back there during all those lunch breaks. The path through the woods was more worn than I remembered, like someone had been walking it daily for weeks, which made sense given Carl's routine. But when I got closer to the pond, I noticed other things that didn't make sense at all. There were areas where the underbrush had been cleared away, not in a random pattern, but in specific spots around the water's edge. fresh tool marks on some trees like someone had been digging and needed to lean a shovel against them. The ground in 3 or 4 places looked different, recently disturbed but already starting to grow back with spring grass. I told myself he'd probably been burying trash or maybe dealing with some dead animals he'd found. But something about the size and shape of those patches made my chest tighten. The next morning, Carl could tell something was different. He kept watching me while he worked, and when lunchtime came, he didn't head back to the pond like usual. Instead, he sat in his van, windows down, just staring toward the woods like he was guarding them. I tried to act normal, talked about the weather and upcoming cattle auction, but there was this tension between us now, thick as the humid air before a storm. That Friday, he told me his mother was sick down in Arkansas, said he needed to leave for the weekend but would be back Monday morning. He seemed nervous when he said it, kept rubbing his hands on his jeans, and I noticed dirt under his fingernails, the kind that gets deep under there when you've been digging without gloves. Saturday morning his van was gone like he'd said it would be, but something kept gnawing at me about those disturbed patches by the pond. I tried to focus on my usual weekend work, but by noon I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a spade from the tool shed and walked back there, my heart hammering harder with each step through those woods. The first patch I tried was near a big oak tree, and about 2 feet down, my spade hit something that wasn't root or rock. I cleared more dirt away with my hands, and that's when I saw it. A piece of fabric looked like part of a jacket, pink or maybe coral-colored. My mouth went completely dry and I stood there for maybe 5 minutes just staring at that scrap of material before I walked back to the house and called the sheriff. They brought in a whole team that afternoon, deputies and state police and people with equipment I'd never seen before. By Sunday evening, they'd found 2 bodies, both young women, both in shallow graves near the pond's edge. One had been there maybe 6 weeks, the other probably 3, according to what I overheard the investigators saying. The pink fabric I'd found belonged to a University of Iowa student who disappeared from a rest stop 50 miles away. The other woman was a waitress from a truck stop near the Missouri border, last seen walking to her car after a night shift. Both of them had been reported missing, their pictures in newspapers I'd never thought to connect to my quiet farmhand who kept to himself and worked hard. Carl never came back Monday morning, never came back at all. They found his van abandoned at a rest area in South Dakota 3 days later, wiped clean of prints but with blood evidence in the back that matched both victims. Turns out Carl Brennan wasn't even his real name. He was actually Robert Hutchinson, wanted for questioning in similar disappearances across 4 states over the past 2 years. The FBI agent who interviewed me said he'd probably been using farms like mine all along, places with woods and water, isolated enough that nobody would notice fresh digging, owners too busy with daily work to pay attention to remote corners of their property. They figured he kept moving whenever he sensed someone getting suspicious, just drifting from one farm job to another, state to state, leaving bodies buried in places that might never be found if not for dumb luck or an observant owner. They never caught him, far as I know. Sometimes I check online, looking for news about Robert Hutchinson or similar cases, but there's nothing. The FBI said he probably changed his appearance, got new fake documents, might even be working another farm somewhere right now. I had to drain that pond later that year, couldn't stand looking at it, and I sold the back 40 acres to my neighbor Tom, who turned it into pasture. But even now, 5 years later, whenever someone comes looking for farm work, especially if they're traveling through and seem eager to work alone, I tell them I'm fully staffed. I learned the hard way that sometimes the real monsters are just quiet men with dirt under their fingernails, and the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly where to hide their kills. Moving into Grandma Rose's farmhouse felt like stepping into a time capsule from 1973, complete with harvest gold appliances and that peculiar smell of old wood mixed with decades of Sunday dinners. I'd just turned 31 that March, and after the reading of her will, I suddenly owned 40 acres of Indiana farmland with a 2-story house that hadn't seen a proper update since disco was king. My sister wanted nothing to do with it, said the isolation would drive her crazy, But after years of cramped city apartments and neighbors who practiced drums at midnight, the solitude seemed like exactly what I needed. The nearest neighbor lived about 3 miles down the gravel road, and honestly, that suited me just fine. I spent the first 2 weeks hauling donation boxes, scrubbing floors, and discovering all the quirks of a house that had settled into its bones over 50 years. Everything changed on my third Thursday there, when I heard the first knock while washing dishes after dinner. Just a soft tap 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 on the back porch door, barely audible over the running water. I dried my hands and went to check, but the motion sensor light showed nothing except the empty wooden deck and the field stretching out toward the old barn about 200 feet away. Figured it was just a branch or maybe a raccoon investigating the new human in residence. But then it happened again the next night, this time at the kitchen window while I was making tea. Same rhythm, same gentle persistence, except windows don't get knocked on by falling branches. I pulled back the curtain fast, trying to catch whatever it was, but again saw only darkness and my own reflection staring back. By the fourth night, when the knocking moved to the cellar door inside the mudroom, I'd stopped trying to explain it away as wildlife. Saturday morning brought the first real sign that something was seriously wrong. I came downstairs to make coffee and noticed the basement door handle was covered in dried mud, thick globs of it caked into the grooves like someone had grabbed it repeatedly with filthy hands. The door was still locked, thank God, but seeing that dirt made my chest tighten in a way those knocks hadn't. I grabbed paper towels and cleaned it off, telling myself maybe I'd done it myself while gardening and forgotten, even though I hadn't been near the basement in days. The handle was old brass, worn smooth by decades of use, and the mud had dried into every tiny scratch and dent. What really got me was how the dirt pattern showed multiple grip attempts, overlapping prints like someone had stood there for a while, trying again and again. I spent that whole day checking every lock twice, moving through the house with this nervous energy I couldn't shake. The farmhouse had too many entrance points, I realized, counting them like a paranoid inventory. Front door, back porch door, mudroom side entrance, cellar door from inside, plus the external bulkhead doors that led straight to the basement from outside, though those had been padlocked shut since I arrived. 9 windows on the ground floor alone, most with those old-style latches that barely held. The barn had its own problems, a side door that wouldn't close properly, and windows so old the glass had that wavy quality that distorted everything you saw through them. As darkness fell that Saturday, I found myself pulling all the curtains closed, something I'd never done before, preferring to wake with natural light. But natural light seemed less important than not feeling like I was living in a fishbowl. That night, around 2 in the morning, the gravel driveway woke me up. You learn the sounds of a place pretty quick when you're alone, and that crunching rhythm of footsteps on loose stones was unmistakable. Not an animal. Animals don't walk with that steady, deliberate pace. I crept to my bedroom window and peered through a gap in the curtains, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. The moon was bright enough to see the driveway clearly, and there was someone down there, just a dark shape moving between the house and the barn. They weren't hurrying, weren't trying to hide, just walking back and forth like they were measuring something or checking distances. The figure stopped near the barn side entrance, stood there for maybe 30 seconds, then walked toward the house, disappearing from my line of sight as they moved under the window. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but the battery was at 12% because I'd forgotten to charge it, and of course Grandma Rose never had a landline installed. The nearest police station was in town, 25 minutes away on a good day. I stood there in my pajamas, listening to those footsteps circle the house, stopping at what sounded like each door, each window. They were testing things, I realized with this sick feeling spreading through my gut. Learning which boards creaked, which gravel patches were loudest, mapping out the property like they were planning something. After what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes, the footsteps moved back toward the barn. Then came the sound that made me grab the baseball bat from under my bed, the sharp crack of breaking glass, clear and deliberate, from the barn side window. Not an accident, not thrown rock, but something purposeful that sent shards tinkling onto the ground. The house went silent except for my own breathing, But I knew they hadn't left. They were in the barn now, doing God knows what, and I was trapped between calling 911 with my dying phone or saving the battery in case things got worse. I chose to wait, clutching that bat like it could actually protect me from someone bold enough to break into property while I was clearly home. Through the thin farmhouse walls, I heard them exit the barn and start their methodical check of the house's entrances. First the front door, a slow turn of the handle, testing. Then footsteps on the wraparound porch, boards groaning under their weight. The back door handle jiggled next, longer this time, more insistent. They knew exactly which doors I'd checked earlier, which ones might have been forgotten. The mudroom door got the same treatment, then silence for a moment before I heard them at the bulkhead doors, the metallic rattle of the padlock being tugged. My phone showed 9% battery when I finally dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher about the intruder. She kept asking me to speak up, but I could hear them moving along the house's foundation, probably checking the ground floor windows now. The dispatcher said a unit was on the way, but we both knew what 25 minutes meant out here. She stayed on the line, my phone dropping to 6%, then 5%, her voice cutting in and out as the connection struggled. Then I heard what I'd been dreading, the subtle scrape of a window being pushed up. Not forced, not broken, just sliding open like they knew exactly which one had a broken latch. The dispatcher was saying something about locking myself in the bathroom, but my phone screen went black, battery dead. I heard feet hit the floor downstairs, careful but not silent, and the sound of someone moving through my grandmother's kitchen like they'd been there before. The old farmhouse betrayed every movement with creaks and groans, so I knew they were heading for the stairs. I had maybe 30 seconds to decide. Hide, run, or fight. The bat in my hands felt like a toy against someone this prepared. Someone who'd spent nights learning my routine, watching me pull those curtains closed. I crept to my bedroom door and turned the lock, this pathetic little button lock that wouldn't stop anyone determined. Through the heating vent, I could hear them downstairs, opening drawers in the kitchen, not ransacking but searching for something specific. Then their footsteps moved to the living room, paused at what must have been the family photos on the mantel, and headed for the staircase. The first step groaned under their weight, then the second, each sound getting closer while I stood there trying to think of literally any option that didn't end badly. I made my choice when they reached the landing. Grabbed my car keys from the dresser, slipped out of my bedroom as quietly as I could manage, and headed for the back stairs that led straight to the mudroom. These stairs were narrower, servant stairs from when the house was built, and I knew them better than the intruder could. My bare feet made almost no sound on the old wood, though my breathing seemed impossibly loud in the darkness. I reached the mudroom just as I heard them trying my bedroom door upstairs, the handle turning once, twice, then a sharp shoulder slam against the wood. The mudroom door was locked from earlier, but I had the key on my ring. My fingers fumbled with it while crashes came from upstairs, the sound of my bedroom door finally giving way. Got the door open and ran for my car, gravel cutting into my feet, not caring about the pain, just needing to reach the driver's door before they realized I'd escaped. The engine turned over on the first try, thank God, and I reversed hard down the driveway, not bothering with headlights until I hit the main road. In the rearview mirror, I saw a flashlight beam sweep across the mudroom door, then disappear. I drove straight to the police station in town, walked in barefoot and probably looking insane, and told them everything. 2 officers followed me back, but by then the house was empty. Just my broken bedroom door and muddy footprints through the kitchen as proof I wasn't imagining things. They found where someone had been camping in the barn's loft, maybe for weeks, with a sleeping bag, empty food cans, and a notebook filled with observations about the house, my routine, which lights I turned on at what times. The officer showed me one page that made me pack up and leave that same day. A detailed drawing of the house's floor plan, every door and window marked, with notes about which ones were usually locked and which weren't, dated starting 3 days before I'd even moved in. Never did find out who it was, though the police suspected someone who'd been watching the obituaries, knowing the house would be empty after Grandma Rose died. They probably didn't expect anyone to move in so quickly, had already settled into the barn when I arrived, then decided to wait me out or scare me off rather than find somewhere else. I sold the farmhouse 6 months later to a developer who turned it into 3 rental properties, and I made sure to do the closing remotely. Sometimes I still dream about those footsteps on gravel, that methodical testing of doors, the sound of someone moving through a house like they belonged there more than I did. But mostly I'm just grateful for my tiny apartment with its chain lock, deadbolt, and neighbors close enough to hear me scream. Sometimes life throws you into situations that change everything you thought you knew about reading people. During the summer of 2022, I was barely keeping my head above water financially, juggling 2 part-time jobs at a warehouse and a gas station just to make rent on my studio apartment outside Minneapolis. My cousin Kevin mentioned his neighbor needed someone to watch over a farm while recovering from hip surgery, and the pay was decent enough that I could quit both jobs and still come out ahead. Meeting Harold Garrison that first time, he struck me as your typical Minnesota farmer. Weathered hands, soft-spoken, the kind of guy who probably had coffee with the same group of buddies every morning for the past 40 years. His property stretched about 60 acres of corn and soybeans, with a modest farmhouse, 2 barns, and a chicken coop that had seen better days. The arrangement seemed perfect for someone like me who needed steady work and didn't mind the isolation. Harold walked me through everything despite moving slowly with his walker, pointing out where he kept the feed for the chickens and goats, showing me the irrigation controls, explaining which gates needed checking every evening. He had this gentle way of talking, never raising his voice even when the rooster tried attacking my legs during the tour. The daily routine he laid out was straightforward: morning feeding, checking water lines, making sure equipment stayed locked in the main barn, and doing a perimeter check before dark. He handed me a flip phone for emergencies and told me to call if anything seemed unusual, though he assured me nothing ever happened out there except the occasional deer getting into the corn. I moved into the small guest room above the garage that same week, grateful for the chance to save money and work somewhere peaceful for once. For 3 months, everything ran like clockwork. Harold had his surgery in early September and went to stay with his daughter in Wisconsin for recovery, leaving me to handle the farm solo. The work became meditative in a way I hadn't expected, waking up at sunrise to feed the animals, walking the irrigation lines while morning mist hung over the fields, spending evenings repairing fence posts or organizing tools in the barn. Neighbors would wave when driving past, but mostly kept to themselves, and the only regular visitor was a feed delivery guy named Dale, who came every 2 weeks and always had some local gossip to share. Harold called every Sunday to check in, his voice getting stronger each week, asking about the animals and reminding me to oil the tractor even though I'd already done it twice. I started feeling genuinely proud of keeping everything running smoothly, even managed to fix the automatic water system for the goats when it broke, without having to call anyone for help. That Tuesday in November started like any other, until I noticed the black SUVs parked at the end of the driveway around 10 in the morning. 4 vehicles total, all with tinted windows, and I could see people in dark clothing standing near them talking into radios. My first thought was maybe Harold had passed away, and his family sent lawyers or something, but when they started walking up the driveway in formation, I knew this was something else entirely. The woman in front held up a badge before I could even ask what was happening. FBI, she said, and they had a warrant to search the property as part of an ongoing investigation. My mouth went completely dry as she handed me the paperwork, which had Harold's name and address but was filled with legal language I couldn't process in the moment. They told me to stay by the house while they conducted their search, and one agent remained with me, politely declining to answer any of my questions about what they were looking for or why they were there. I watched from the kitchen window as teams spread across the property with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar equipment, focusing most of their attention on the northwest corner, where Harold kept an old equipment shed I'd never needed to enter. The agent staying with me, a younger guy who introduced himself as Agent Nowak, seemed sympathetic to my confusion, and eventually mentioned they were investigating connections to interstate drug trafficking from several years back. He asked how long I'd been working there, if Harold had any regular visitors, whether I'd noticed anything unusual about the property or found anything strange while doing maintenance. All I could tell him was what I knew. Harold seemed like a quiet old farmer who mostly talked about corn prices and his bad hip, and the only things I'd found were rusty tools and mice nests in the barns. By noon, they'd set up a tent near the old shed and brought in excavation equipment, which made my chest tighten, in a way I couldn't quite explain. The digging went on for hours, methodical and precise, while I tried to go about normal tasks to keep myself from staring at them constantly. Around 4 in the afternoon, Agent Nowak's radio crackled and his whole demeanor shifted as he listened to whatever was being said. He told me to stay put and jogged over to where the others had gathered around a hole they'd dug about 6 feet deep. I could see them photographing something, placing evidence markers and making phone calls with serious expressions that made my stomach churn. After what felt like forever, the lead agent came back and informed me they'd discovered a buried 55-gallon drum containing what appeared to be firearms, packaging materials consistent with drug trafficking, and personal effects that might belong to a missing person from 2016. She said they'd need me to come to their field office the next day to give a formal statement, and that I should find somewhere else to stay for a few days while they processed the scene. That night at Kevin's house, I couldn't stop scrolling through news articles on my phone, searching Harold's name along with terms like drug trafficking and organized crime. What I found made me feel like I'd been living in some kind of alternate reality for the past 3 months. Harold Garrison wasn't just some retired farmer. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, he'd been connected to a major trafficking network that moved methamphetamines through the rural Midwest, using farms and agricultural businesses as cover for distribution. The articles mentioned he'd testified in a federal case in 2008 that sent several people to prison, including a man named Vincent Russo, who was believed to control much of the drug trade across 3 states. There were grainy newspaper photos of a younger Harold in a suit outside a courthouse, looking nothing like the gentle old man who'd shown me how to check if eggs were fertilized. The missing person the agents mentioned turned out to be Anthony Cullen, one of Russo's former associates who disappeared right after Harold's testimony, and who many believed had been planning to retaliate against witnesses. The next morning at the FBI field office, I spent 4 hours going through every detail of my time at the farm, with 2 agents who recorded everything and had me sign multiple statements. They showed me photos of people, asking if I'd seen any of them around the property, pictures of vehicles they wanted to know if I recognized, even screenshots of social media profiles to see if Harold had mentioned any of these names. One photo stopped me cold. A man with distinctive scarring on his neck who I remembered seeing at a gas station near the farm about a month earlier. Someone who'd made small talk about the weather, but seemed to be watching me more than was normal. The agents exchanged looks when I mentioned this, making notes and asking for every detail I could remember about the encounter. They explained that several of Russo's old crew had been released from prison in recent years and were persons of interest in ongoing investigations, though they couldn't tell me if I was in any danger or if Harold had known about the barrel buried on his property. What really got to me was when they pulled up a map showing all the properties Harold had owned or managed over the years. 12 different farms spread across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Most sold off in the early 2000s, right before his testimony. The agents theorized that these properties might have been used as waypoints in the trafficking network, places to store product or money temporarily while moving it across state lines. They asked if Harold had ever mentioned other properties, if he'd given me keys or access codes to anywhere else, if there were areas of the farm he'd specifically told me to avoid. The truth was, he'd been nothing but straightforward about everything. Even gave me a detailed map he'd drawn by hand of all the irrigation lines and gates. But now I wondered about that shed in the northwest corner, how he'd casually mentioned it was just full of old equipment from his father's time and not worth messing with, how the lock on it was newer than any other lock on the property. I tried calling Harold after leaving the FBI office, but his phone went straight to voicemail, and his daughter Gloria called me an hour later, sounding shaken and angry. She said federal agents had shown up at her house that morning with questions, that Harold had suffered what they were calling a stress-induced cardiac episode and was in the hospital, that their family lawyer had advised them not to speak with anyone about the situation. She wanted to know what I'd told them, if I'd known anything about her father's past, why I hadn't warned them something like this might happen. I tried explaining that I was just as blindsided as anyone, that her father had only ever been kind to me, but she hung up before I could finish. The next few days were a blur of news vans showing up at Kevin's house. Once word got out about my connection to the farm, reporters calling my phone until I had to turn it off, and the surreal experience of seeing Harold's farm on the evening news with yellow tape around the excavation site. A week later, Agent Nowak called with an update that made everything click into place in the worst possible way. The forensics team had determined that the barrel had been buried sometime in late 2016, several months after Harold's testimony had concluded, and Anthony Cullen had disappeared. The personal items inside, a wallet, a class ring from a Wyoming high school, a distinctive watch, had been confirmed as belonging to Cullen through DNA evidence from his family. The weapons matched those used in several unsolved crimes across state lines, and the packaging materials had residue from methamphetamines, matching the chemical signature of Russo's old operation. Most disturbing was that soil analysis showed the barrel had been moved at least once before being buried at Harold's farm, suggesting someone had deliberately placed it there either to frame Harold or hide evidence where they thought no one would look. Harold himself was still in the hospital, and through his lawyer maintained he had no knowledge of the barrel, but the investigation had expanded to include several other former witnesses from the 2008 trial who might have been similarly targeted. The FBI cleared me of any involvement after 2 more weeks of investigation, but the damage to my life was already done. Every job application I submitted seemed to dead end once employers Googled my name and found articles about the farmhand who uncovered mob burial site or caretaker's shocking discovery on Minnesota farm. Harold passed away in his sleep 3 weeks after that initial raid, never having left the hospital, never able to explain his side of the story or whether he'd suspected something might be hidden on his property. Gloria sent me a brief text saying the farm would be sold to cover legal fees and that my final paycheck would be mailed. I ended up moving to stay with my sister in Colorado, starting over with a warehouse job where nobody knew about my connection to the case. Sometimes I think about that morning feeding the chickens, having no idea that federal agents were already positioned at the end of the driveway, that I was standing above evidence of a murder while scattering corn feed, that Harold might have hired me specifically to have an innocent witness on the property in case this day ever came. The not knowing is what keeps me up at night, whether I was just incredibly unlucky or whether Harold chose me precisely because I was naive enough to never question the gentle old farmer with the bad hip who just needed someone to tend his animals. People say isolation changes you, and after inheriting my uncle's farm out in northern Montana, I was starting to understand what they meant. It was early October when I first noticed something wasn't right, about 6 months after I'd moved out there to escape the mess of my life in Phoenix. The property stretched for nearly 200 acres, mostly wheat fields and pasture land, with the nearest neighbor being old Frank Gibbs, who lived 8 miles down the gravel road. I'd been fixing up the place slowly, learning to work the land, finding peace in the endless quiet that wrapped around the farmhouse like a heavy blanket. My German shepherd Duke had taken to the country life better than I had, spending his days chasing rabbits and barking at the occasional deer that wandered too close to the vegetable garden I was trying to keep alive. That particular Monday started like any other, with me heading out to the barn around dawn to check on the equipment I'd been restoring. Duke was already outside, sniffing around the chicken coop when I noticed his hackles rise, his nose pressed against the dirt near the barn's side entrance. Fresh boot prints marked the damp ground, definitely not mine since I always wore the same worn work boots, and these had a different tread pattern, deeper and wider. Someone had been here during the night, walking along the barn's perimeter, stopping at each window to peer inside based on how the prints clustered. My first thought was maybe Frank had come by looking for me, but he always honked his horn at the gate, never just showed up unannounced, especially not in the middle of the night. Over the next few days, more signs appeared that made my gut tighten with unease. The grain shed's padlock, which I always clicked shut out of habit from my uncle's warnings about raccoons, hung open on Wednesday morning. The hasp twisted slightly like someone had used a crowbar on it. My toolbox in the barn had been rifled through, wrenches and screwdrivers arranged differently than how I'd left them, with my good hammer missing entirely. Duke started acting strange too, growling at empty air in the middle of the night, pacing the porch with his ears pinned back, refusing to venture past the yard's edge after sunset. I'd convinced myself it was probably just some drifter passing through, maybe looking for easy pickings or a place to sleep. Nothing more sinister than that. Friday brought the storm, one of those sudden October monsters that rolls down from Canada without warning, turning the sky black by 4 in the afternoon. Rain hammered the metal roof so hard it sounded like gunfire, and the wind bent the old cottonwoods nearly horizontal, their branches scraping against the house like fingernails on wood. I was in the kitchen making dinner, just beans and cornbread since I hadn't made it to town for groceries that week, when Duke started that low, threatening growl he reserved for real danger. He stood facing the living room window, every muscle in his body coiled tight, lips pulled back to show his teeth. Through the rain-blurred glass, I could barely make out the yard, but then I heard it clearly. The unmistakable sound of someone testing the front door handle. A slow, careful turn followed by pressure against the frame. The handle jiggled again, harder this time, and then stopped. Duke's growl deepened as footsteps moved along the porch, heavy boots that didn't care about being quiet anymore, pausing at each window. I grabbed the shotgun from above the refrigerator, checking that both barrels were loaded with the buckshot I kept for coyotes, then killed the kitchen lights. In the darkness, I could track the intruder's movement by sound alone, boots on wood, then the squeak of someone pressing their face against glass trying to see inside. They went around to the side door near the mudroom, rattling that handle too, then to the back door off the kitchen where I stood holding my breath. The knob turned slowly, once, twice, and I could hear breathing on the other side, wet and labored like whoever it was had been running or was excited about something. Duke launched himself at the back door, barking with a fury that made the walls shake, and the footsteps retreated fast, running now toward the barn. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and went to the window, catching a glimpse of a figure in a long, dark coat disappearing into the barn's main entrance, the one I never locked because the latch had been broken for years. My rational mind said to stay put, wait it out, let whoever it was take what they wanted and leave. But then I heard the crash of breaking glass from the barn, followed by what sounded like feed bags being thrown around. This wasn't just theft anymore. Someone was destroying my property, maybe looking for something specific or just trying to draw me out there. The smart thing would have been to barricade myself in the house, but I'd put too much work into that barn. Too much of my uncle's legacy was stored in there, and anger started mixing with the fear in my chest. I pulled on my rain jacket and headed for the back door, Duke right beside me, his fur already soaked from his earlier barking fit at the door. The second we stepped outside, the wind nearly knocked me sideways, rain hitting my face like cold needles, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We made it halfway to the barn when I saw the broken window on the side, glass shattered inward just like the premise said, and there was blood on the jagged edges, dark and fresh, dripping onto the hay scattered below. Whoever broke in had cut themselves badly, maybe on their hand or arm, and I could see the blood trail leading deeper into the barn. Duke went rigid beside me, a whine escaping his throat, and that's when I noticed the silence. No more crashing, no more movement from inside, just the storm and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I pushed through the barn door, shotgun raised, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to reveal absolute chaos. Feed sacks were slashed open, grain spilling across the floor in golden puddles, tools pulled from their hooks and scattered like someone had been searching frantically for something. The blood trail led toward the back where I kept the old farming equipment, and as I followed it I could hear something else now, a rhythmic thumping coming from outside, from the direction of the storm cellar. The cellar door was around the back of the barn, one of those angled metal doors that led down to the old root storage my uncle had built decades ago, and the sound was definitely someone working on it, trying to pry it open with something heavy. I'd welded that door shut myself just last month after finding a family of possums living down there, so whoever was out there was wasting their time. But the determination in those steady blows made my skin prickle with a different kind of fear. Duke suddenly bolted toward the barn's rear exit, and I followed, rounding the corner to see a man in that long, dark coat hunched over the cellar door, using my missing hammer to beat on the welded locks. His left hand was wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, blood seeping through, and when my flashlight hit him, he spun around fast, revealing a face I recognized but couldn't quite place. Gaunt features, wild gray hair plastered to his skull by the rain, eyes that had that hollow look of someone who'd been living rough for too long. He dropped the hammer and took a step back, raising his good hand like he was surrendering, but his eyes kept darting between me and that cellar door like it held something precious. Then it clicked. This was Walter Briggs, Frank's younger brother who'd disappeared about 3 years back after his wife died. Everyone assumed he'd left the state to start fresh somewhere else. "Walter, what the hell are you doing here?" I kept the shotgun pointed at his chest, trying to make sense of why he'd been stalking my property, why he was so desperate to get into that cellar. He opened his mouth, closed it, then started laughing, this broken sound that competed with the storm's fury. "Your uncle, he promised me," Walter said, his voice hoarse like he hadn't used it in months. "Said if anything happened to him, I could have what's down there. Said he'd leave a note, instructions. But there was nothing. Nothing in the will, nothing in the house." His injured hand gestured wildly at the cellar door. "I know it's there. I helped him hide it back in '89, 200 grand in cash from that development deal that went bad. Money nobody knew about. Money that should have been mine too since I introduced him to those investors." The pieces started falling into place. My uncle's sudden ability to buy new equipment despite claiming poverty, his paranoid behavior in his final years, always checking locks, installing security lights that I'd thought were excessive for a remote farm. Walter took another step back, stumbling slightly, and I could see he was in bad shape. Probably hadn't eaten properly in days, that hand needing medical attention before infection set in. "I've been living in the old Mitchell place," he said, naming an abandoned farmhouse about 10 miles north that had been empty since I was a kid. "Been watching, waiting for you to leave for supplies. But you never stay away long enough for me to break through that weld. Tonight, with the storm, I thought maybe you wouldn't hear me working on it." Duke kept growling, staying between Walter and me, and I had to make a decision fast because this situation could go bad quickly with a desperate, injured man who'd been living on the edge for years. "Walter, there's no money down there," I said, though honestly I had no idea what my uncle might have hidden. "I cleaned it out when I moved in. Just old canning jars and rusted tools, nothing worth risking your life over." His face crumpled like I'd just told him his family had died all over again, and he sank to his knees in the mud, that injured hand cradled against his chest. I lowered the shotgun slightly, seeing him broken like that in the rain, and made a choice that probably saved both our lives that night. "Come inside, let me look at that hand," I said, surprising myself with the offer. "We'll call Frank, get you somewhere warm and dry, get you some help." Walter looked up at me with those hollow eyes, then nodded slowly, all the fight drained out of him. We walked back to the house together, Duke keeping a watchful eye on our unexpected guest, and I bandaged his hand while coffee brewed, the storm still raging outside. Frank arrived 2 hours later in his truck, having fought through flooded roads to get there, and the brothers had a conversation I pretended not to hear, lots of tears and apologies and promises to get help. Before they left, Walter told me exactly where my uncle had put the money, behind a false wall in the cellar's northeast corner. Said I'd earned it by showing him kindness when I could have done much worse. After they drove away, I sat in my kitchen until dawn, thinking about that money supposedly hidden beneath my feet, about secrets and promises, and what desperation could drive a person to do. When the sun finally came up, I walked out to the barn with Duke, grabbed a sledgehammer and went to work on that cellar door. Not sure what I'd find, but knowing I needed to see for myself what had driven Walter to the edge of sanity. The cellar was exactly as I'd left it before welding it shut, musty and filled with broken shelving, except for the northeast corner Walter had described. Behind what looked like solid stone, I found a narrow gap, and inside that gap, wrapped in plastic and duct tape, was more money than I'd ever seen in one place. Not quite 200 grand anymore. Time and moisture had damaged some bills despite the wrapping, but enough to change everything if I wanted it to. I stood there for a long time, holding those bundles of cash that had cost Walter his sanity and my uncle his peace of mind, understanding finally why the old man had become so paranoid near the end. That afternoon, I drove to Frank's place where Walter was resting, handed him half the money in a duffel bag, and told him my uncle would have wanted him to have it, which might have been true or might have been my way of buying back my own peace of mind. Walter ended up checking into a treatment facility in Billings, got himself sorted out, and last I heard he was living with his daughter in Oregon, working at her hardware store, trying to make up for the lost years. I used my half to fix up the farm properly, installed a real security system, and adopted 2 more dogs from the shelter because Duke deserved some backup after that night. Sometimes I still hear sounds outside during storms, but now it's just the wind or animals seeking shelter. Nothing more sinister than nature doing what nature does, and I sleep better knowing that some secrets are better shared than buried, even if it takes a desperate night and a bloody hand to bring them to light. When I bought the Hutchins property in February 2023, everyone in town told me I got a steal. The old man had died alone in January, no kids, distant relatives who just wanted it gone. 39 acres of decent farmland in central Pennsylvania for less than most people pay for a starter home. I'd been saving since my late 20s, working construction in Philadelphia, dreaming of having my own place where I could fix things with my hands and not answer to anyone. The house needed work but had good bones. The workshop out back, though, that's where things got complicated. It was a separate building about 50 yards from the main house. Metal siding painted barn red, windows so caked with grime you couldn't see inside. The real estate agent said the old man used it for storage, hadn't been opened in years. I figured I'd clean it out, turn it into a proper workspace for woodworking, maybe build furniture to sell at the farmer's market in town. The first time I stepped inside that workshop, the smell hit me like a physical thing. Not decay exactly, more like decades of stale air, motor oil, and something else I couldn't place. Mustiness mixed with old leather and dust so thick it coated my teeth. There were tools everywhere, most of them rusted, hanging on pegboards or scattered across a workbench that ran the length of the back wall. Boxes of old tractor parts, coils of wire, mason jars filled with nails and screws. Pretty standard stuff for a farm workshop. The concrete floor was cracked in places, stained dark with what I assumed was oil or transmission fluid. I spent the first few days just hauling junk out, filling the bed of my truck over and over, making runs to the county dump. My nearest neighbor, an older guy named Eugene who ran cattle on the property next door, would wave from his tractor when he saw me working. He'd known the previous owner, said he'd been a quiet man, kept to himself, didn't cause trouble. That's how people described everyone out here, it seemed. Quiet, kept to themselves. It was on a Wednesday afternoon, maybe 2 weeks into clearing out the workshop, when I noticed the floor wasn't level. Not in an old building settling kind of way, but deliberately uneven. There was a section near the back corner, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, where the concrete sat slightly higher than the rest, like someone had poured a patch job years ago and hadn't bothered to smooth it out properly. When I swept the area clean, I could see the seam where new concrete met old. The color was different too, lighter gray, not as weathered. I grabbed a pry bar from my truck and started chipping at the edge, curious more than anything. The concrete was only a couple inches thick, not the proper 4 or 5 you'd expect. Underneath wasn't gravel or dirt. It was wood. Plywood, specifically, cut to fit the space and laid flat. My brain started working through possibilities. Maybe an old root cellar, or a spot where the original floor had rotted through. But why cover it with such a thin layer of concrete? Why not fix it properly? I pulled up the plywood sheets. They came away easily, practically fell apart in my hands from moisture damage. The smell that came up from below made me gag and step back, one hand covering my mouth and nose. It wasn't death, nothing like the dead raccoon I'd found in the house chimney. This was earthier, damper, like opening a grave that had been sealed for decades. The hole below was maybe 4 feet deep, barely enough to qualify as a crawl space. The walls raw dirt held back by old 2x4s. It was dark down there, even with the afternoon sun coming through the workshop windows. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, leaned over the edge to look down. At first, I just saw dirt and more wood, some kind of shelf or platform built into the space. Then I saw the box. It was plastic, one of those weatherproof storage containers you'd buy at a hardware store, gray with yellow latches. It sat on the wooden platform like someone had placed it there carefully, deliberately. No dust on the lid. Someone had been down there recently, or at least more recently than the concrete patch suggested. I should have called someone right then. Looking back, that would have been the smart move. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I was alone out there on 39 acres with no one around to tell me not to climb down into that hole. I lowered myself in, feet first, my boots landing on the wooden platform with a soft thud that sent vibrations through the dirt walls. The space was cramped, ceiling so low I had to crouch. The air was thick and hard to breathe, like being buried alive. I reached for the box, popped the yellow latches, lifted the lid. The smell hit me first, not rot but something chemical, like old perfume mixed with must and plastic. Inside were Ziploc bags, the gallon-size kind, each one labeled with black marker. Names and dates. Melissa, July 1994. Amber, November 1996. Christine, May 1998. There were 7 bags total, each one containing items that made my chest tighten. A driver's license, a necklace with a small silver cross, a hair tie, a pack of cigarettes, disposable cameras, the kind you'd buy at a gas station and drop off at a drugstore to get developed. One bag had a hospital wristband, the paper kind that disintegrates if you wear it too long, but this one was preserved, sealed away from air and time. I lifted one of the cameras, turned it over in my hands. It was light, probably no film left inside or maybe never used at all. The bag labeled Christine had a Pennsylvania driver's license, the old style from the 90s with the Keystone logo in the corner. Her photo showed a girl with blonde hair and a shy smile, 21 years old when the picture was taken. The license had expired in 2001. Inside the same bag was a thin silver bracelet with a charm shaped like a sunflower, and a paper napkin from a place called Bernie's Roadhouse with a phone number written in blue ink. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was holding. These weren't things someone throws away. These were kept, treasured even, in the most horrifying way possible. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking now despite myself, and started taking pictures of everything. Each bag, each item, the labels with those names and dates. The crawl space suddenly seemed smaller, the air thinner, and I realized I needed to get out of there before I passed out or worse. I climbed out of that hole faster than I went in. The box clutched against my chest and walked straight to my truck without looking back at the workshop. My fingers were trembling so badly it took 3 tries to unlock my phone and dial 911. The dispatcher asked if there was an emergency, if anyone was hurt, and I didn't know how to answer that. Were these women hurt? They had to be. People don't lose their driver's licenses and precious jewelry and end up fine. I told her I'd found something on my property, something the police needed to see immediately. And she must have heard the panic in my voice because she didn't ask more questions, just said units were on the way. I sat in my truck with the doors locked, the box on the passenger seat, staring at the workshop like it might come alive and swallow me whole. 20 minutes felt like hours. When the county sheriff finally pulled up the gravel driveway, lights flashing but no siren, I practically ran to meet him. The sheriff's name was Daniels, a broad-shouldered man probably in his mid-50s with gray stubble and tired eyes that had seen too much. He listened to my explanation, looked at the box, then called for backup before we even went back to the workshop. Within an hour, my property was swarming with deputies, state police, people in plain clothes who I assumed were detectives. They taped off the entire workshop, brought in portable lights, and started photographing everything. A detective named Warren pulled me aside, asked me to walk him through exactly what happened, step by step. I told him about the uneven floor, the concrete patch, the plywood, climbing down into the crawl space. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, his pen moving quickly across the page. When I mentioned the names and dates on the bags, his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, like he'd been waiting for this call for a very long time. Warren told me they'd run the names through their database, see if anything came up. He asked me not to leave town, standard procedure, he said, though I could tell he didn't consider me a suspect. I was just the unlucky bastard who bought the wrong piece of land. They kept me there for hours, asking the same questions different ways, making sure my story stayed consistent. By the time they let me go back to the house, the sun was setting and more vehicles had arrived, including a white van with forensic unit printed on the side. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat at my kitchen table drinking coffee, watching the lights from the workshop area sweep back and forth across my yard like searchlights. The next morning, Warren came to the house and asked if we could talk. He had a folder with him, thick with papers and photographs. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table and opened it carefully, like he was handling something fragile. The first photo he showed me was a missing person flyer from 1994. Melissa Hartley, 23 years old, last seen hitchhiking along Route 15 near Lewisburg. Blonde hair, green eyes, wearing a denim jacket and carrying a backpack. She'd been traveling from State College to visit her sister in Harrisburg and never arrived. Warren laid out more photos, more flyers. Amber Sutton disappeared in 1996 while walking home from her shift at a truck stop diner outside Sunbury. Christine Porter, the one whose license I'd held in my hands, vanished in 1998 after her car broke down on a rural road near Selins Grove. 4 more women, all between 1994 and 2001, all from small towns within a 50-mile radius of where I was sitting. All cases that had gone cold decades ago, filed away in boxes in some basement evidence room, families still wondering, still hoping. Warren explained that they'd suspected a serial predator back then, someone who knew the area, knew the back roads, knew how to move without being noticed. But they never had physical evidence, never had a suspect, never had anything except missing women and grieving families. Until now. The items in that box matched personal effects reported missing with each woman. The disposable cameras were being sent to a lab to see if any images could be recovered. They'd already started excavating the property, bringing in ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Warren's voice was steady when he told me this, professional, but I could see the weight of it in his eyes. They found the first remains 3 days later, buried in a shallow grave near the tree line at the edge of the property, maybe 200 yards from the workshop. Then another. Then 2 more in a section of woods I'd never even walked through yet. The forensic teams worked for weeks, grid by grid, marking spots with little flags whenever the dogs alerted or the radar showed anomalies. I stayed in a motel in town during most of it. Couldn't stomach being in that house knowing what was underneath my land. The media picked up the story fast. News vans lined the road outside the property, reporters doing stand-ups with my barn in the background, helicopters circling overhead. I stopped reading the articles, stopped watching the coverage. They were calling him the Route 15 killer, even though Warren told me they'd probably never know his real hunting grounds, how far his territory actually stretched. The old man who owned the place, Howard Brennan, had died of a heart attack in his living room with no one around. Convenient, Warren said bitterly. No trial, no confession, no answers for the families about what happened to their daughters and sisters. By the time the investigation officially concluded in early June, they'd recovered the remains of 6 women from my property. 1 was still missing, and Warren believed she might be buried somewhere else, maybe on land that had since been developed or sold off. The families were notified, given what closure could be offered after so many years of not knowing. Some of them reached out to me, sent letters thanking me for making the call, for not just covering the hole back up and pretending I'd never seen it. I didn't feel like I deserved thanks. I just did what anyone would do, what anyone should do. The property sat empty for months after that. I couldn't sell it, not with its history plastered across every news site in the state. Eventually, I hired a crew to tear down the workshop, haul away every piece of metal and wood, and pour new concrete over where it had stood. The house I kept, though I've never spent another night there. I rent it out now to a young couple who knew the story and didn't care. Said they didn't believe in ghosts or bad energy. Maybe they're right. Maybe it's just land, just a house, just wood and nails and dirt. But I know what was hidden there. I know those women deserved better than to disappear into the soil of some quiet farm where nobody thought to look. Every time I drive past on my way to visit Eugene next door, I see those yellow flags in my mind, dotting the landscape like terrible flowers, marking spots where lives ended and secrets stayed buried for 30 years. Running a small farm alone wasn't something I planned, but after my divorce went through in 2015, keeping the property felt like the only stable thing left in my life. 40 acres of corn and soybeans in rural Alabama, a white farmhouse that creaked in the wind, and a barn that desperately needed new doors. Most of the year I could manage everything myself, but harvest season always demanded extra hands. That's why I posted the job listing at the feed store in July 2023, looking for 2 temporary workers to help bring in the crops before the weather turned. I got a handful of responses, and after a few phone calls, I settled on hiring 2 guys who seemed capable enough. One was a college kid named Austin, who needed summer money before heading back to school. The other was a man who introduced himself as Elliot, maybe in his mid-40s, with a handshake that lasted a second too long and eyes that seemed to catalog everything they touched. The first week went fine, or at least I thought it did. Austin was chatty and worked hard, always asking if he could take water breaks or use the bathroom, polite in that way young people are when they're trying to make a good impression. Elliot, though, he worked in silence mostly, but every now and then he'd pause what he was doing and just watch me. Not in an obvious way, but I'd turn around while hauling a basket of tools and catch him staring from across the field, hands on his hips, like he was studying something. He started asking questions by the 3rd day, casual at first. What time did I usually wake up? Did I lock all the doors at night? Was the house alarmed? When I told him that was none of his business, he just smiled and said he was asking because he worried about me being out here alone, that a woman by herself needed to be careful. The way he said alone made my stomach tighten, like he was confirming something he already knew. I brushed it off, told myself I was being paranoid, that he was just making conversation. But then he asked about the layout of the house, whether the bedroom was upstairs or down, and if the back door had a deadbolt or just a regular lock. By the end of that first week, I started noticing Elliot lingering after Austin left for the day. Austin would wave goodbye, hop in his beat-up sedan, and drive off down the dirt road, but Elliot always found a reason to stick around an extra 20 minutes. He'd say he needed to finish organizing tools in the barn, or that he wanted to check the irrigation lines one more time, but I'd see him through the kitchen window just standing there, looking at the house. Not working, not moving, just standing with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted like he was memorizing something. One evening, I walked out to tell him it was time to go, and he was standing right by the porch steps, close enough that I nearly ran into him. He didn't apologize or step back. He just looked at me and said he'd been wondering if I ever got scared out here, if I ever heard strange noises at night. When I told him no, and that he needed to leave, he nodded slowly, said goodnight, and walked toward his truck, but he kept turning around every few steps to look back at the house. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified, the house settling, branches scraping the siding, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit straight up in bed, a slow, deliberate crunch of gravel outside, like someone taking careful steps to avoid making noise. I got up and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see out into the yard. The motion sensor light by the barn hadn't triggered, so whoever or whatever it was hadn't gotten close enough yet. But I could see a shape moving along the tree line, slow and methodical, tracing the perimeter of the property. My first thought was a deer or maybe a coyote. We got those sometimes. But the movement was wrong. It was too steady, too purposeful. The shape stopped near the side of the house, right below my bedroom window, and just stood there. I held my breath, pressing myself against the wall, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After what felt like forever, the shape moved again, heading toward the front porch, and I heard the soft creak of the wooden steps under weight. Footsteps. Human footsteps. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and pulled up the security camera app I'd installed a few months back. Nothing fancy. Just a single camera pointed at the front door that recorded to the cloud. The feed loaded slowly, buffering in that maddening way it does when you need it most. And when the image finally appeared, my chest went tight. There was Elliot, standing directly in front of the camera, staring straight into the lens. Not moving, not knocking, just standing there with his face maybe 6 inches from the camera, close enough that I could see the reflection of the porch light in his eyes. His expression was blank, completely neutral, like he was waiting for something or testing something. I watched, frozen, as he stayed there for what must have been 30 seconds, and then the feed flickered once, twice, and went black. The app said "connection lost" in gray text at the bottom of the screen. I tried refreshing it, closing and reopening the app, even restarting my phone, but the camera wouldn't come back online. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. The next morning I went outside to check the camera, and the lens was covered in a smear of something, mud or grease, I couldn't tell, but it had been deliberately wiped across it so the camera couldn't record anything clearly. The memory card inside was gone too, popped right out of the slot and taken. I stood there on the porch staring at the empty slot, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. This wasn't random. This wasn't some confused drifter who wandered onto my property. Elliot had walked the perimeter of my house in the middle of the night, stood outside my bedroom window, climbed my porch steps, disabled my only security measure, and stolen the evidence. When he and Austin showed up for work an hour later, Elliot looked exactly the same as always, calm and quiet, offering me a polite nod as he grabbed his gloves from the barn. I wanted to scream at him, to demand what the hell he thought he was doing, but something in the way he looked at me, steady and patient, made the words catch in my throat. Austin was oblivious, talking about some party he'd gone to over the weekend, but Elliot just worked in silence, occasionally glancing toward the house like he was checking on it. I decided right then that I needed to fire him, had to get him off my property before things got worse. Around lunchtime, I pulled him aside, away from Austin, and told him as calmly as I could manage that I didn't need his help anymore, that I'd pay him for the week, but he should collect his things and go. The change in his face was immediate. That blank, neutral expression twisted into something darker, his jaw tightening and his eyes narrowing like I'd just insulted him. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the sweat and dirt on him, and said in a low voice that he didn't take orders from people who hide things. I had no idea what he meant, and I told him so, but he just shook his head slowly and said I knew exactly what he was talking about. When I insisted he leave, he crossed his arms and said no. Just like that. No. He said he had every right to be here, that he'd signed on for the whole harvest season, and if I tried to force him off the property, he'd make sure everyone in town knew what kind of person I really was. The threat was vague enough that it didn't make sense, but specific enough that it scared me. He wasn't yelling, wasn't being violent, but the way he stood there, immovable and confident, made it clear he had no intention of leaving. That afternoon, I called the sheriff's office, explained the situation as best I could without sounding hysterical. The deputy who answered said unless Elliot had physically threatened me or damaged my property, there wasn't much they could do. Trespassing required him to refuse to leave after being formally warned, and since he was technically still employed, even if I wanted him gone, it was a civil matter. He suggested I document everything, maybe get a restraining order if things escalated, but that could take days to process. I hung up feeling helpless and furious, trapped on my own land with someone who clearly had plans I couldn't begin to understand. Austin finished up his work around 4 and headed home like usual, waving goodbye and saying he'd see me the next day. Elliot, though, he stayed. He didn't even pretend to work. He just sat on an overturned bucket near the barn, facing the house, watching me through the kitchen window as I moved around inside. When I turned off the lights and went upstairs, I saw his truck still parked by the road, headlights off, just sitting there in the dusk like a predator waiting for night to fall. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the hallway upstairs with a baseball bat across my lap and my phone in my hand, listening to every sound the house made. Around 11, I heard the gravel driveway crunch, slow and deliberate, the same pattern as the night before. Then came the sound of the barn doors creaking open, the old metal hinges groaning in protest. He was inside the barn. I could picture him in there, moving through the shadows, maybe looking through my tools, my supplies, learning the space. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and then I heard footsteps on the gravel again, circling around the side of the house. They stopped right below the bathroom window, and I heard a faint scraping sound, like something metal dragging across the siding. My whole body was tense, every muscle locked, waiting for the sound of breaking glass or a door being forced open. Instead, the footsteps moved again, this time toward the back of the house. I heard the back door handle twist. Once, twice, testing it. I'd locked it, I knew I had, but hearing someone try it anyway made my breath come in short, panicked gasps. The handle stopped moving and for a moment there was complete silence. Then I heard his voice, muffled through the door but clear enough to understand. He said he knew I was awake, that he could see the light from my phone glowing in the upstairs window. He said I should just let him in so we could talk, that he wasn't trying to scare me. He just wanted to have a conversation about things I'd been keeping from him. I had no idea what he meant and I didn't answer. My throat was too tight to speak, and even if I could, I wasn't going to engage with him. After another long silence, I heard his footsteps retreat across the gravel, but they didn't go far. They stopped somewhere near the side yard, and then I heard the soft click of a lighter and smelled cigarette smoke drifting through the window screen. He was smoking out there, just standing in my yard in the middle of the night like he owned the place. I stayed frozen in that hallway until the sun started to rise, and when I finally looked out the window, his truck was gone. I called my brother in Georgia the second it was a decent hour, and he drove up that same day with 2 of his friends, both big guys who worked construction. I told them everything, showed them the disabled camera, described the nights of stalking and the refusal to leave. When Elliot showed up for work that afternoon, he saw the 3 of them standing on my porch with their arms crossed, and for the first time since I'd met him, his expression changed. The confidence drained out of his face, replaced by something cautious, almost nervous. My brother walked right up to him and told him in no uncertain terms that he was done here, that if he ever set foot on this property again or came within a mile of me, they'd make sure he regretted it. Elliot didn't argue, he didn't say a word. He just stared at me for a long moment, like he was memorizing my face, then turned and walked back to his truck. He drove off slowly, and I watched until his taillights disappeared down the road. For the next week, my brother and his friends stayed with me, sleeping in the guest room and taking shifts, keeping watch at night. Elliot never came back. I checked with Austin a few days later, and he said Elliot had called him once, asking weird questions about whether I'd said anything about him, whether the police had been involved, but Austin told him he didn't know anything and to stop calling. I changed all the locks on the house, installed 3 new cameras with backup power supplies, and got a dog. A German shepherd named Juno who barks at everything that moves. The barn doors got new locks too, industrial-strength deadbolts that can't be opened from the outside. I eventually finished the harvest with Austin's help, and a couple of day laborers from a staffing agency that actually ran background checks. I never found out what Elliot meant by his accusations, what he thought I was hiding, and honestly, I don't care. Maybe he was delusional, maybe he was on something, or maybe he was just a dangerous man looking for a vulnerable target. Whatever it was, I got lucky that my brother showed up when he did. Even now, a year later, I still think about those nights. I think about how close I came to being completely alone with someone who had studied my routines, disabled my security, and refused to leave even when told directly. I think about the way he tested that back door handle, the way he stood in my yard smoking a cigarette like he had all the time in the world. The worst part isn't even what happened. It's knowing how much worse it could have been if I hadn't made that call, if my brother hadn't dropped everything to help me. I don't hire temporary workers anymore. I either do the harvest myself, or I pay a professional crew with insurance and references I can verify. Juno sleeps at the foot of my bed every night, and I still check the cameras obsessively before I go to sleep, watching the feeds until I'm sure nothing's moving out there in the dark. People ask me sometimes if I ever saw Elliot again, if he ever came back, and the answer is no. But I still lock every door twice, and I still wake up at the smallest sound, and I probably always will. Life on our farm had been running in a steady rhythm when all of this happened. I'd been juggling chores, raising 2 kids, and helping my spouse plan a long overdue remodel of the old farmhouse bedroom. The place was built in the 1950s and still carried that stubborn, creaky personality of homes that have seen too many seasons. We'd talked for years about opening up that room to make space for a proper desk and some shelves, since the kids kept spreading their school projects all over the kitchen table. That morning felt ordinary enough. Sunlight coming through the kitchen window, the smell of coffee drifting through the hall, nothing hinting that the day would take such a sharp turn. The crew we hired was small, just 2 workers, both locals who had fixed half the barns within a 20-mile radius. One of them, a guy named Shane, had a habit of humming old country tunes while he worked, which always echoed weirdly in the narrow hallway. I remember carrying a basket of laundry when I heard his humming stop all at once. Not like he took a break, more like his attention got yanked away by something he didn't expect. By the time I walked toward the bedroom, he was standing on a ladder with a piece of drywall still in his hand, staring at a dark recess in the wall like he'd stumbled onto a tunnel. Bits of insulation were floating in the air, drifting down like strange yellow snowflakes. I asked him if everything was okay, and he answered in this strange half-whisper, telling me he'd found a hollow pocket sealed off behind the studs. It wasn't part of the room's layout. It shouldn't have existed. He pulled his flashlight from his belt and tilted it inside the space. From where I stood, I could smell something damp, stale, almost like a cellar no one had touched in decades. He climbed down and motioned for me to stay back, and that was the moment the air around us seemed to stretch thin. A moment later, he reached into the cavity and stepped away fast, dropping a sheet-wrapped bundle onto the tarp. The bundle wasn't big, no more than the size of a household pillow, but the corners sagged in a way that made my knees feel weak. When he peeled the sheet open just enough to see what was inside, the room felt smaller than it had ever been. It wasn't a full skeleton, not neatly arranged, just a cluster of small bones gathered together, tangled in a mold-stained bedsheet. The fabric looked older than anything in that house, the kind of decay you only see when time has been eating away in secret. The worker didn't touch anything again, and I remember stepping back until my shoulder hit the hallway wall. My mind kept trying to attach a logical explanation. Animals, debris, some bizarre mistake. But deep down, I already understood this was no accident. Within minutes, we'd called the sheriff's office, and that normal, peaceful morning evaporated into something I still think about every single night. The deputies arrived quicker than I expected, their boots leaving dusty prints along our hallway runner. One of them, a woman named Deputy Marin, crouched beside the bundle with a steadiness that didn't quite match the tension in her jaw. She didn't touch the bones, just studied them, shining her flashlight in small, controlled motions. The other deputy stood near the window, scribbling something in his notebook while asking basic questions about the remodel, about when the wall had last been opened, about the house's previous owners. I kept thinking about how many mornings I'd walked past that very spot in the wall without knowing there was a person, or what remained of one, sealed inside for who knows how long. By mid-afternoon, detectives joined the deputies, along with a crime scene tech who laid out a blue tarp and started photographing every angle of the cavity. They moved carefully, almost reverently, like they didn't want to disturb the quiet lingering in the home's bones. The lead detective, a man named Harris, spoke calmly as he explained they suspected the remains belonged to a woman who had vanished ages ago. He didn't give many details at first, but his tone carried the weight of something long forgotten, or purposely buried. He asked if I'd heard anything strange from neighbors about the property's past. I told him the truth. We'd heard bits and pieces, mostly old gossip about a previous owner who drank too much and argued loudly with his wife, but no one ever hinted at anything like this. Later that evening, the techs finally removed the bones, still wrapped in the decayed sheet, placing them into a container that looked too clinical for something that carried so much human sadness. Watching them carry it through the hallway felt surreal, especially with my kids sitting quietly in the living room, sensing the heaviness in the air. Detective Harris stayed behind to walk through the rest of the house with me and my spouse, asking about odd structural quirks, any renovations done before we moved in, or stories the realtor had shared. At one point, he paused near the back door, tapping the frame as if something about the house was speaking to him in a language he recognized. The next day, neighbors started showing up, not in a nosy way, but with this cautious curiosity, like they were stepping into a story they'd tried to forget. An older man from down the road, Mick, leaned on our porch railing and told the detectives the former owner had been infamous for his temper. He described nights when shouting carried across the fields, followed by stretches of silence so long they made the livestock restless. Another neighbor, Janet, mentioned how the owner's wife had left suddenly decades ago, with no forwarding address and no goodbyes. People assumed she'd run off to escape the chaos of her marriage, and no one questioned it because back then, questioning meant getting involved in someone else's firestorm. Hearing them talk, piece by piece, felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself into an image no one wanted to see. Detective Harris returned 2 days later with a quiet seriousness that made me set aside everything I was doing. He explained that the remains had been confirmed as belonging to the woman neighbors remembered, the one everyone believed had simply packed up and left. He told us the way she was found, wrapped tightly and placed inside a sealed cavity, suggested she hadn't gone anywhere by choice. Hearing that said out loud made the house feel heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He asked me to walk him through the moment the workers opened the wall again, and even though I'd already told the story several times, repeating it to him felt different. There was something in his eyes that made it clear this case wasn't going to fade quietly. A few evenings later, after the kids went to bed, my spouse and I sat in the living room talking about everything the investigation had stirred up. I kept glancing toward the closed bedroom door, imagining the empty cavity behind the studs. The space looked harmless now, just wood and wiring, yet my mind kept circling back to the idea that someone had sealed that woman away, likely in a moment of rage or fear, and gone on living in the house as if nothing had happened. I couldn't stop wondering how many arguments, how many slammed doors, how many desperate moments had happened in those same rooms before we ever set foot inside. The thought clung to me like humidity before a storm. The detectives eventually pieced together a rough timeline. Based on the neighbors' recollections and records from old hospital visits and police calls, the former owner had been spiraling for years. They believed the crime happened during one of his violent episodes. He had died several years before we bought the place, and whatever secrets he carried were buried with him, at least until our renovation peeled back the layers he'd left behind. Learning that there would be no confession, no confrontation, no real explanation left a strange hollowness inside me. Justice felt incomplete, like a door left slightly open without anyone willing to close it. Over the following weeks, we finished the remodel, though the room never felt the same. The drywall was new, the paint fresh, but every time I stepped inside, I felt a faint heaviness in the air. Not fear exactly, but a deep awareness of the past. Sometimes, when the house settled at night and the wood popped the way old houses do, I'd picture the woman who never got the chance to leave the farm alive. We added a small framed wildflower print to the new shelf in her memory, even though we never knew her name personally. It seemed wrong to pretend nothing had happened, and yet life continued. Kids doing homework, meals on the stove, the dogs barking at passing tractors. The house had carried a terrible secret for decades, but now that it had been uncovered, all we could do was acknowledge it and move forward. Growing up around farmland shaped the kind of person I became, but I never imagined I'd end up owning a place with a reputation whispered about in diners and gas stations. When I took over that property, I was juggling 2 part-time jobs and trying to stabilize my life after a messy breakup, so I didn't have the luxury of giving in to local rumors. The cornfield behind the house had this odd habit of sagging in the same area every warm season, creating a shallow dip no matter how often I tried to level it out. Neighbors told me the previous operator never managed to fix it either, but I assumed it was just years of sloppy irrigation. At that point, I was focused on catching up on bills, keeping the equipment running, and convincing myself I hadn't made a stupid financial decision. The land looked healthy enough, and nothing about that sinking patch seemed dangerous, just annoying and inconvenient. By the time early summer rolled around, I finally saved enough to bring in a small crew to help regrade the field properly. The morning they arrived, I remember feeling this strange mix of relief and embarrassment. Relief because the problem would finally be dealt with, and embarrassment because the crew leader, a guy named Spencer, kept pointing out the signs of past erosion that I should have noticed myself. As they started moving soil, the machinery kept giving off this uneven groan, the kind it makes when it's fighting something that shouldn't be there. I figured it was just compacted earth or some old farm debris, maybe forgotten fence posts or rusted tools buried over time. Still, watching the blade screech as it scraped against something solid made me shift my weight from one foot to the other, unsure if we were about to uncover a rock the size of a fridge or a damaged pipe waiting to explode water everywhere. It didn't take long before the crew realized the obstacle wasn't stone or metal piping. When the machine lifted its blade again, there was a faint clank, the kind that sounded too smooth, too deliberate to be scrap. Spencer waved me over and pointed to a thin sliver of metal poking through the dirt, perfectly straight and coated in this dull bluish gray that didn't match anything used on the farm. The workers formed a loose semicircle, muttering guesses to each other while scraping the soil away by hand. Even from a few feet back, I could tell whatever we'd hit wasn't small. A rectangular outline began to appear, corners sharp enough to stand out from the surrounding earth. One of the younger workers asked if I had ever buried equipment out here, and I laughed in a way that didn't feel natural, mostly to hide the tension building behind my ribs. The moment they uncovered the front grille, even partially, everything around us went strangely quiet. I recognized the shape instantly. The nose of a pickup truck wedged upright in the ground like someone had dropped it from the sky. The metal was warped in places, caked with soil, but the brand emblem was still visible despite the grime. Spencer kept brushing away dirt, eventually revealing the windshield, or what was left of it. The glass had shattered ages ago, leaving jagged edges embedded in the frame. When he aimed his flashlight into the cabin, nobody spoke for a good 10 seconds. Inside, slumped against the steering column, was a human shape still buckled in place. The clothing was faded and barely recognizable, but the outline of a body was unmistakable. I felt this tightening inside my chest, not from fear exactly, but from the abrupt realization that the land I'd been tending like it was mine alone had been hiding someone's final moments. News travels fast in small communities, and within an hour the property felt less like my farm and more like a crime scene. Patrol cars rolled down the gravel path one after another, kicking up dust that clung to the air like powder. An officer directed me to stand near the fence while they set up a perimeter, and I remember gripping the wood rail, trying to process the idea that this field had been holding someone's secret for so long. The sheriff on site, a man named Hendrik, asked a handful of routine questions, but his expression grew sharper the moment I mentioned the name of the farm's previous operator. I'd always known the man by reputation only, someone people described with vague discomfort, the type who made deals in back rooms and avoided eye contact. I had no idea that what he left behind might be more than neglected machinery and unpaid debts. When the crew finally managed to widen the dig site enough to pull the truck free, the vertical orientation became even more unsettling. It stood almost perfectly straight when they lifted it with the winch, like some grave marker that had been hidden under the soil. Hendrik kept pacing around it with the kind of focus I'd only ever seen in people trying to piece together something bigger than a simple accident. A forensic tech leaned inside the cab and confirmed that the driver had never escaped, never even unbuckled. The position of the body suggested a sudden impact, but the angle and depth in which the truck was buried made the explanation impossible to accept as an accident. By that point, a few locals had gathered near the road, each one talking in low tones, throwing uneasy glances my way, as if I were somehow responsible for not knowing what had been beneath my own land. Later that afternoon, investigators traced the license plate and matched the truck to a missing persons case that had nearly slipped out of collective memory. The owner was identified as Joel Mercer, a guy who'd vanished 2 decades earlier after leaving a bar on the edge of town. I'd heard his name once or twice in passing, mostly in stories older men told after a couple drinks, nameless warnings about choosing better company and not trusting certain folks. Hendrik explained that Joel had been involved in a confrontation shortly before he disappeared, a heated argument with the man who used to run my farm. Apparently, Joel had accused him of dealing in stolen vehicles, but no one ever proved anything. When Joel never came home, the theory that he'd run off on his own became the easiest one to accept, especially once the farm changed hands and that whole chapter faded into rumor. What unsettled me most was realizing how often I'd walked across that sinking patch, how many mornings I'd passed over it with coffee in hand without noticing anything more than a soft depression in the earth. The idea that a man had been trapped down there while seasons changed overhead gave me a sense of weight I couldn't explain. Investigators kept expanding the search radius, combing through the rest of the field as if expecting to find more surprises. Watching heavy machinery peel back layers of soil made the farm feel unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Even the air felt different, as though the land itself had been waiting for someone to uncover its history and finally acknowledge the truth buried beneath it. As the evening stretched on, Hendrik pulled me aside and told me something that still clings to my thoughts whenever I walk that field. Years ago, before the farm changed owners, neighbors had reported hearing machinery running long after midnight, engines revving, metal clanging, strange activity with headlights sweeping across the corn rows. Most assumed the operator was working odd hours because he was difficult to deal with and preferred avoiding people. No one imagined those late nights might have involved burying a truck vertically with someone inside. The sheriff's tone implied he believed the man had help, or at least enough privacy to carry out something so heavy and deliberate. Standing there in the fading light, I couldn't stop imagining the moment the ground swallowed Joel's truck, how quickly the soil must have collapsed around it, erasing every trace until only that slow seasonal sinking hinted at what lay beneath. The authorities wrapped up their work sometime after nightfall, leaving deep trenches and equipment tracks carved across the field. For the first time since buying the place, I didn't feel any attachment to the land, just a strange heaviness, like the farm had been carrying a burden and had finally dropped it into my hands. Word spread through town that more arrests might follow, that people connected to the former operator were being questioned. A detective mentioned that receipts, forged documents, and scrap parts had surfaced in places no one expected. Every new detail pushed the story further away from simple tragedy and closer to a network of crimes that had been overlooked for far too long. Meanwhile, Joel's family was located and notified, reopening wounds they thought had finally scarred over. Over the next week, I struggled to resume anything resembling routine. Walking into the barn felt different. Stepping outside at dawn felt different. Even simple chores made me overly aware of the ground beneath my boots. I kept thinking about the years Joel spent hidden below the soil while life continued overhead. Birthdays, storms, new owners, harvest seasons. The crew eventually filled the massive excavation and leveled the ground again, but the land never returned to how it looked before. The patch where the truck had been removed settled unevenly, creating a subtle ridge instead of a dip. I didn't bother correcting it. Maybe part of me felt the land deserved to keep a scar of its own. something honest that marked what had happened instead of swallowing it again. A month later, after all the interviews, reports, and cleanup, the sheriff returned to hand me the last of the paperwork. He told me the case would finally be closed soon, and that the former operator, now living far from here, was facing charges connected not only to Joel but to several vehicles reported stolen around the same period. Hearing that brought me a kind of closure I didn't expect. I stood there with the folder in my hand, looking out across the cornfield while the wind moved through the rows like a slow hush. The land felt quieter than before, almost as though it had released something old and heavy. I still don't understand every piece of what happened on that property long before I arrived, but at least the truth isn't buried anymore. And strangely, that makes it easier to live here now, even if I'll never walk that field again without thinking of the man who never made it home. Something about that morning still clings to me. Maybe because life on the ranch had finally started to feel steady again after a messy stretch of debts and repairs. I'd taken over the place from an older couple who moved south to be closer to their grandkids, and they left behind a few things they figured I'd grow into, including a big livestock guardian dog named Ranger. He had a blocky head, pale eyes that always looked half-focused on something far away, and a habit of pacing the fence line like he was tracking a ghost. I didn't mind. Quiet company suited me. Most days were just feed runs, checking the water tanks and trying to keep coyotes from getting bold. Nothing suggested that anything in my pasture held a secret worth remembering, much less retelling. At first, Ranger's odd habit barely registered. Every afternoon, as predictable as the sunset, he would tug old metal tools, chunks of plastic, even a cracked bucket or two across the pasture. He dragged everything to the far western corner, where the grass grew in a crooked swirl because the soil never seemed to decide if it wanted to be sandy or packed hard. I figured he was building himself some kind of nest, the way bored animals sometimes do. But there was something strange in the way he worked. Steady, determined, almost methodical. Whenever I called him back, he'd glance at me, then return to nudging whatever scrap he'd found toward that same patch of ground. I joked aloud once, telling him he looked like he was starting a junkyard, but his focus didn't shift for a second. After a couple of weeks, irritation started creeping in. I kept finding random farm tools missing from the shed, small things like a trowel or wire cutters, stuff I knew I hadn't misplaced. And every single item showed up in that same corner, half nestled into the dirt like Ranger wanted to bury the whole ranch there. One afternoon, after tripping over a cracked feed pan he had dragged out, I decided enough was enough. I clipped his leash on and tried pulling him away from the area to break the routine. He resisted in a way that surprised me, not aggressive, just solid, like a tree leaning into the wind. The moment I let the tension slacken, he went straight back, planted his paws and stared at a particular spot on the ground, as if waiting for me to finally catch on. That stare worked on me more than anything else. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't excitement. It was more like he held a piece of knowledge he didn't know how to deliver. I crouched down where he kept pointing his attention, and noticed a shallow dip in the soil. Not deep, not obvious, but unnatural in a pasture that usually settled evenly. The grass there grew shorter, almost sunken, as if weight had pressed it down repeatedly. I pushed my fingers into the dirt just to feel the texture, and it crumbled looser than the surrounding ground. That was the first moment I felt a quiet pressure building in my chest, the kind that comes when part of your mind knows there's only one way this ends, and the other part begs you to walk away. I went back to the house for a shovel, telling myself I was just humoring a dog with quirks. But the whole walk back to that corner felt heavier than it should have. Ranger didn't wander or sniff around the way he usually did. He stayed close, moving with a strange patience, like he knew exactly what I was about to uncover. The soil gave way faster than I expected. A couple of scoops in, the loose top layer fell apart, exposing darker, colder earth beneath it. The smell shifted too, not rotten, not fresh, just a dull, stale scent that didn't belong in open pasture. Ranger stepped back and sat down, rigid and alert. His gaze locked on the hole as if he were bracing for something I hadn't yet seen. The first unmistakable thing I uncovered was a scrap of fabric. Pale, dirty, and frayed. It clung to the soil like it had been swallowed whole over time. The sight of it knocked something loose in my memory. A local news segment from years before about a woman whose car had broken down on a rural highway not far from here. They said she vanished while waiting for help. Volunteers had searched ditches and fields up and down the road, but eventually the coverage faded, swallowed by newer stories. Still, that scrap of fabric felt like a message from a past everyone had quietly filed away. My throat tightened as I dug a little deeper, hands working slower now, careful, almost reluctant. Then I uncovered the unmistakable curve of a bone, human, thin, small. I didn't need to see any more to understand what Ranger had been trying to tell me all along. I set the shovel down and stepped back, my legs buzzing with an energy that made it hard to stand still. Ranger didn't move closer or farther. He just stayed there beside me, breathing slow, steady, almost grounding. I took out my phone with a clumsy urgency, dialing the sheriff's office and trying to explain what I'd found without letting my voice crack. They told me not to touch anything else, not to dig further, and to wait at the fence line until deputies arrived. The investigators showed up faster than I expected, likely because missing person cases, even old ones, still sit heavy on people's minds out here. They cordoned off the area, thanked me for stopping when I did, and brought in a forensic team before the sun dipped low. I sat on the tailgate of my truck with Ranger leaning against my leg, the both of us watching strangers move around a place that had always felt familiar until that afternoon. When the sheriff approached me, his face carried a mix of sympathy and exhaustion that told me what I already suspected. The remains likely belonged to the woman who had disappeared 3 years earlier. He mentioned something else too, a former farmhand who had worked for the previous owners. A man who left suddenly, never collected his last paycheck, and was seen near the stranded woman's car the day she vanished. What struck me later was how none of this ever came up when I bought the ranch. The previous owners mentioned that the old farmhand, a guy named Mason, had quit without warning, but they chalked it up to him being unreliable. They never hinted at anything darker, and maybe they truly didn't know. Investigators questioned me about anything he might have left behind, any odd stories, any places he favored on the property. I didn't have much to offer, just a memory of an empty bunkhouse with a cigarette burn on the windowsill and a broken radio lying on the floor, as if whoever lived there left in a rush. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the sheriff told me they were issuing new warrants and reaching out to nearby counties, almost certain they were dealing with a man who hadn't simply walked off a job. In the days that followed, the ranch felt different. Not haunted, just heavier, as if the land itself had been holding something in its lungs for years and had finally exhaled. Ranger stayed close to me every morning, not pacing, not gathering scraps, just calm in a way I hadn't seen before. A detective stopped by to tell me they'd confirmed the remains belonged to the missing woman. They found personal items buried slightly deeper, fragments of a purse, a key fob, a bracelet with tiny teal stones. I didn't know her, but seeing those objects made everything ache in a way I hadn't expected. It turned the story from a headline into a person. When word got out, a few locals dropped by with casseroles and uneasy small talk, the way people do when tragedy brushes too close to their world. One older resident told me he remembered seeing the farmhand at a gas station the same week the woman disappeared, loading something into the back of an old pickup with mismatched doors. Nobody thought much of it at the time. People around here keep their eyes on their own problems unless something screams for attention. Hearing that made me look at the pasture differently. How close everything had been. How easily it could have stayed hidden forever if not for a dog who refused to give up. Eventually, the investigators packed up their equipment, the media attention drifted elsewhere, and the ranch settled back into its usual rhythm. But the corner of that pasture never felt like just another patch of land again. I installed a small wooden marker there. Not a memorial exactly, just something to acknowledge what the ground had held. Ranger visits it sometimes, sitting quietly as if keeping a final watch. They never found Mason, but the sheriff believes they will. People like him always leave a trail somewhere down the line. As for me, life goes on in the slow, steady way it always has out here. But I trust Ranger a little differently now. When he stops and stares at something, I pay attention. He saw the truth long before I ever did.